Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I jerked awake in the darkness, my heart already hammering before I could even figure out why. The inside of my tent felt wrong somehow. Different. My camping blanket was twisted around my legs from tossing in my sleep, and the night air had turned cool against my face. Something had woken me up. I fumbled for my thick glasses, knocking over my flashlight in the process. The plastic clattered against a rock, the sound abnormally loud in the quiet forest. Wait. Quiet? I slid my glasses onto my face, the world coming into focus as I strained to listen. No chirping crickets, no croaking frogs, no rustling leaves, nothing but a dead, heavy silence that pressed against my eardrums. Even the usual whisper of wind through the pines above the old mine entrance had stopped. That's when I felt it, this weird tingling sensation behind my ears. Not like pins and needles, but something else, something primal. The certainty of being watched crawled across my skin like ants. I checked my watch, 3:12 a.m. Tommy and Brad had left hours ago after helping me set up camp. They'd tried to convince me to come back to town with them, said sitting alone in the woods wouldn't fix things with Lisa. But after that shouting match with her at the Dairy Queen, I needed space. 2 miles of forest between me and East Canton seemed about right. The fire outside my tent had died down to embers. I needed to get it going again. I unzipped the tent flap with trembling fingers, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The night air hit my face as I crawled out, machete in one hand, flashlight in the other. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight. My campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. Folding chair, cooler, the remains of the hot dogs we'd cooked. But something felt off. Wrong. The trees around the clearing stood like silent sentinels, their shadows too dark, too still. I crouched by the fire pit and poked at the dying embers with a stick. A few sparks rose half-heartedly, then faded. I added some kindling from the pile we'd gathered earlier, blowing gently to coax the flames back to life. That's when I heard it. A shriek tore through the night. So high-pitched and unnatural, it made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. Not an owl, not a fox, not anything I'd ever heard in these woods. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, echoing through the trees before cutting off abruptly. I froze, the stick still in my hand. My breath caught in my throat. 10 seconds of silence passed. Then another shriek answered from a different direction, maybe 100 yards to my right. This one was deeper, but just as bone-chilling. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Tommy? Brad? That you guys?" Only silence answered. I knew it wasn't them. They were back in town, probably at Brad's house playing Nintendo. Another shriek, this time from behind me, closer to the abandoned mine entrance. My hands shook as I grabbed the machete, its weight suddenly inadequate against whatever was circling my camp. The shrieks continued, trading back and forth between at least 3 different positions around me. They were communicating, whatever they were, talking to each other about me. I stood up slowly, turning in a circle, machete raised. The moonlight cast long shadows across the clearing, making the trees seem to move and shift. My campfire sputtered and died, leaving only the faint glow of embers. A heavy thud shook the ground, then another. Footsteps. Big ones. I swung toward the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness between the trees. At first, I saw nothing. Then movement, large and deliberate, about 20 or 30 feet away. My light caught it for just a second before I instinctively lowered the beam. In that brief illumination, I saw a massive shape moving between the trees. It walked upright on 2 legs, each step vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The creature was covered in dark hair or fur, with a build that reminded me of a gorilla but stood much taller. 7, maybe 8 feet. I couldn't make out its face clearly without the flashlight, but I didn't need to. I knew what it was, what I was never supposed to see, Bigfoot or something like it. Another call echoed through the forest, this one coming from the massive shape. Up close, the sound rattled my bones, like something from the deepest part of hell. My breath came in short gasps. I was an unwelcome intruder here. They'd tolerated me all day while Tommy and Brad were around, but now, in the dead of night, they'd decided I needed to go. I didn't think, I just ran. The machete fell from my hand as I bolted toward the trail that led back to town. My flashlight bounced wildly in front of me, the beam jerking across trees and underbrush. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, feel the ground shaking. The screaming continued, seeming to come from all directions now. I ran blindly, branches whipping across my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My glasses slipped down my nose, but I didn't dare stop to push them back up. After about 20 feet from camp, the footsteps behind me stopped. The screaming faded. But I didn't slow down. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning, legs pumping. The 2 miles back to my parents' house passed in a blur of terror and exertion. By the time I burst through our back door, my shirt was soaked with sweat, my legs wobbling beneath me. Mom found me collapsed on the kitchen floor, gasping for breath, still clutching my flashlight in a white-knuckled grip. "Ethan, what on earth?" She rushed to my side, her face pale with worry. I couldn't form words yet, could only shake my head and gulp air. Dad appeared in the doorway, his hair sticking up from sleep. "Someone attack you, son?" He was already reaching for the phone, ready to call the sheriff. "No," I finally managed. "Not someone." They sat me down at the kitchen table. Mom put a mug of hot chocolate in front of me, though it was August and the house was warm. My hands shook so badly I couldn't pick it up at first. "Start from the beginning," Dad said, sitting across from me. So I did. I told them about waking up to the silence, about the tingling sensation of being watched, about the unholy shrieks that cut through the night, and the massive, hair-covered creature I'd glimpsed in my flashlight beam. They exchanged looks over my head, the kind parents give when they think their kid's lost his mind. "You sure it wasn't a bear?" Dad asked carefully. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs for that long," I said. "And they don't scream like that. Nothing screams like that." "Could have been some local boys playing a prank," Mom suggested, her hand cool against my forehead as if checking for fever. "You know how Tommy and Brad like their jokes." I shook my head. It wasn't them. It wasn't human. Dad sighed, pushing his chair back. "Well, whatever it was, you're safe now. We'll go get your camping gear in the morning." "No!" The word burst from me with surprising force. "I'm not going back there, ever." My father studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. I'll go with some of the guys from the plant. You don't have to come." I slept in my childhood bedroom that night, the covers pulled up to my chin despite the summer heat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive shape moving between the trees, heard those unnatural screams echoing through the forest. The next morning, Dad gathered a group of his buddies from the steel plant. They armed themselves with rifles and headed out to recover my abandoned campsite, clearly expecting to find evidence of bears or pranksters. I stayed home with Mom, jumping at every sound, unable to shake the feeling of being watched even in broad daylight. They returned 4 hours later, Dad's expression unreadable as he carried my tent and the rest of my gear into the garage. "Found your stuff right where you left it," he said, avoiding my eyes. "No sign of any creatures or wild animals?" His friend Mike was more direct. "Didn't see nothing unusual out there, Ethan. Just a bunch of tracks in the mud that could have been deer." "Or could have been something else," muttered Pete, the oldest of the group. When Dad shot him a warning look, Pete shrugged. "Just saying, those prints weren't like any deer I've seen." Dad shooed his friends away, handing each a beer as they left. When we were alone in the garage, he pulled something from his pocket and held it out to me. "Found this stuck to a tree near your tent," he said quietly. It was a tuft of coarse, dark hair, longer and thicker than any animal fur I'd seen before. Not bear, not deer, not human. Dad's voice dropped even lower. "My granddad used to tell stories about the things that lived in those woods. Said they were there long before the mines, long before any of us. Said they mostly kept to themselves, unless someone wandered too deep into their territory." He looked at me, his expression serious. "I always thought they were just stories." I took the tuft of hair, rolling it between my fingers. "What do we do now?" "Nothing," Dad said firmly. "We say it was probably a bear. We don't go back to that part of the forest, and we forget about it." But I couldn't forget. That night changed something fundamental in how I saw the world. The comfortable certainties I'd lived with for 19 years had been stripped away in an instant. I went back to community college when fall semester started. I made up with Lisa, though things were never quite the same between us. I helped my dad at the plant on weekends and pretended everything was normal. But on quiet nights, when the wind blew from the direction of the forest, I sometimes thought I could hear distant cries echoing across East Canton. Inhuman voices calling to each other in the darkness, speaking in a language older than the mines, older than the town, maybe older than humanity itself. I never told Lisa what really happened that night, never told anyone except my parents. Who would believe me? Sometimes I barely believed it myself. But then I'd remember the silence in the forest, the ground shaking beneath those massive footsteps, the primal certainty of being in the presence of something that defied all logic and reason. The tuft of hair disappeared from my dresser drawer a week after the incident. Dad never mentioned it again. Maybe he thought he was protecting me by removing the evidence, helping me forget. But some things you don't forget. Some encounters mark you forever, changing how you see the world around you. I still live in East Canton, got a job at the hardware store after college, married a girl from Massillon. We bought a house on the east side of town, as far from the forest as I could manage while still staying close to family. Sometimes I see hikers or campers heading toward those woods, and I want to warn them. Tell them about the territories they might unknowingly cross, the unspoken boundaries between their world and something else. But I never do. Instead, I keep the windows closed at night and pretend not to hear when distant screams echo from the forest. I tell myself they're just coyotes or foxes or owls. Normal forest sounds with rational explanations. But I know better, and somewhere deep in those woods, they remember me too. Story 2. My shoulders still tense up when I hear branches snap in the woods. It's been almost 20 years since that day on the Salmon River, but some memories burn themselves into your brain like a brand. My name's Marcus Thornwood, and what happened to my sister Eleanor and me back in 2004 changed how I look at the wilderness forever. We'd been planning our trip to the Marble Mountain Wilderness for months. Eleanor had just finished her nursing degree, and I'd taken a week off from the auto shop where I worked. Both of us had grown up hearing Grandpa's stories about striking it rich in the California goldfields, so we figured we'd try our luck at recreational gold panning. The drive from our hometown of Pine Creek to Northern California took us through winding mountain roads, flanked by trees that seemed to scrape the sky. Elena read aloud from a guidebook about the Marble Mountain Wilderness, while I kept my eyes on the road. "Says here the Karuk tribe considers this whole area sacred," she said, tucking her dark hair behind her ear. "Lots of legends about spirits in these mountains." I remember snorting. "You believe in that stuff now? Next you'll tell me Bigfoot's real." Elena smacked my arm with the guidebook. "I'm just saying the place has history, jackass." We arrived in Forks of Salmon on a Thursday morning. It wasn't much of a town, just a scattering of buildings that seemed to have grown out of the forest floor. We stopped at the general store for supplies and got directions to a good panning spot from the owner, a leathery-faced man named Dale. who eyed us with the mild suspicion locals reserve for outsiders. "Stay on the main paths," he warned as we paid for our groceries. "People get lost out there all the time." The spot Dale recommended was about 2 miles upriver, a wide bend where the Salmon River slowed and deposited silt along a gravelly bank, perfect for casual prospectors like us. The river stretched about 80 yards across at that point, running cold and clear over smooth stones. The opposite bank rose steeply, covered in dense forest that climbed all the way up the mountainside. We set up our equipment, gold pans, shovels, a small sluice box, and our camping gear, and got to work. The sun beat down on our backs as we scooped sediment into our pans and swirled water around the rims, watching for the telltale glint of gold. For the first few hours, we found nothing but fool's gold and tiny flakes not worth collecting. "This is harder than Grandpa made it sound," Elena complained, stretching her back. I was about to respond when a sound cut through the river's constant babble, a high, wavering cry from the other side of the water. We both froze. "What was that?" Elena whispered, her eyes fixed on the tree line across the river. "Probably just a fox or something," I said, though it hadn't sounded like any animal I'd ever heard. We went back to panning, but I kept glancing at the opposite shore. The forest there looked darker somehow, the shadows between the trunks deeper than they should have been at midday. 20 minutes later, we heard it again, longer this time, rising and falling like someone in pain. Elena stood up, water dripping from her hands. "That's not an animal, Marcus." "Could be a mountain lion," I suggested, but my voice lacked conviction. Mountain lions screamed, sure, but this sound had syllables, structure, almost like words stretched and distorted. "Should we go check?" Elena asked, already reaching for her backpack. I shook my head. "No way. River's too deep to cross here, and the nearest bridge is back by town." As if in response to our conversation, something hit the water about 10 feet from shore, a branch as thick as my arm, sending up a splash that glittered in the sunlight. We stared at it, then at each other. "Wind?" Elena suggested weakly. Another branch followed, then a rock the size of a cantaloupe that landed with a heavy splash. "That's not wind." I stood up, suddenly uncomfortable with how exposed we were on the open riverbank. The screaming started again, closer this time. I grabbed our binoculars from the backpack and trained them on the tree line. For a long moment I saw nothing but leaves and branches swaying in the light breeze. Then something moved, a patch of darkness shifting between 2 pines, too big to be a deer, too fluid to be a bear. "I think someone's over there," I told Elena, passing her the binoculars. She looked for several seconds. "I don't see anyone, just moving branches." Another rock hit the water, this one landing only 20 feet from us. It was bigger than the first, the size of a basketball, and I felt a cold realization as I stared at it. The river was 80 yards wide. No normal person could throw a rock that size that far. "Pack up," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We're leaving." Eleanor didn't argue. We quickly gathered our equipment, abandoning the sluice box in our haste. The screaming intensified as we worked, no longer separated by pauses, just a continuous wail that made the hair on my arms stand up. More rocks splashed into the river, each one closer than the last. I slung the backpack over my shoulder and grabbed Elena's arm. "Let's go, now." We hurried down the path toward our truck, the screams following us like an invisible predator. I kept my eyes forward, fighting the urge to look back. Elena wasn't so disciplined. She glanced over her shoulder and stumbled. "Marcus," she gasped, clutching my sleeve. "Something's following us on the other bank." I didn't stop walking. "Don't look at it. It's huge," she whispered, "moving through the trees." The path curved away from the river, and the screams finally faded behind us. We reached the truck in record time and threw our gear into the bed. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. "What the hell was that?" Elena asked as I started the engine. I shook my head. "No idea, but I'm starving, and I need a drink." We drove to a small diner at the edge of Forks of Salmon, the Hungry Bear, its sign featuring a cartoon grizzly with a knife and fork. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fried food. A few locals occupied the booths, giving us curious glances as we entered. We slid into a booth by the window, still rattled. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with Doreen on her name tag, took our orders with the efficient disinterest of someone who'd been serving tourists for decades. After she left, Elena leaned forward. "We should tell someone about what happened, the park ranger or—" "And say what?" I interrupted. "That we heard screaming and someone threw rocks at us? They'll think we're crazy or making it up." Two men at the counter turned at our conversation. They were Native American, both in their 50s or 60s, wearing faded flannel shirts and baseball caps. One of them slid off his stool and approached our table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Couldn't help overhearing. You folks have trouble by the river?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Something strange happened while we were panning." "Screaming?" the man asked. "Things thrown in the water?" Elena and I exchanged looks. "Yes," she said. "How did you know?" The man pulled out a chair from a nearby table and sat down without asking. His companion remained at the counter, watching us. "Name's Ray Blackwater," he said. "That's my brother Joe. We've been fishing these rivers our whole lives." "I'm Marcus. This is my sister Elena." Ray nodded. "What you encountered wasn't no person, wasn't no animal either, at least not the kind most folks know about." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. Ray glanced around the diner, then leaned closer. "People around here call 'em different things. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. Our people have our own name. They've been in these mountains since before humans came." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. "Wait," I said. "You're seriously telling us we ran into Bigfoot?" Ray shrugged. "Call it what you want. They don't like strangers in certain places. That bend in the river where Dale sent you, that's one of their territories." "You're saying Dale knowingly sent us to a Bigfoot hotspot?" Elena asked, incredulous. "Dale's a jackass," Ray's brother Joe called from the counter. "Thinks it's funny when tourists get scared off." I leaned back, trying to process what I was hearing. These men weren't joking. They were discussing this like it was common knowledge, as normal as warning someone about bears or mountain lions. "So what did we actually see?" I asked. "All I spotted through the binoculars was movement in the trees." "You're lucky," Ray said. "They don't always just scare folks off. Sometimes they follow 'em, lead 'em deeper into the woods. People disappear in these mountains all the time." Our food arrived, and Doreen raised an eyebrow at Ray. "You telling these kids your crazy stories again?" Ray smiled, just giving some friendly advice. "Don't mind him," Doreen told us. "Ray sees Bigfoot every time he has too much whiskey." But her dismissive words didn't match her eyes, which darted nervously to the windows as she spoke. Ray stood up. "You folks be careful out there. They remember faces. And they got territories all through these mountains." He rejoined his brother at the counter. Elena and I ate in silence, the food tasteless despite our hunger. When we finished, I paid the bill while Elena waited by the truck. Ray and Joe were leaving at the same time, and Ray paused beside me at the register. "One more thing," he said quietly. "If you go back, don't bring cameras or recording equipment. They hate that more than anything." I felt a chill. I hadn't mentioned to Ray that Elena and I had already discussed returning with cameras to document whatever was out there. "Thanks for the warning," I said stiffly. Ray nodded and left. Through the window, I watched him and Joe climb into an old pickup truck and drive away, dust billowing behind their tires. Eleanor was quiet as we drove back to our motel in Orleans, about 20 minutes from Forks of Salmon. The sun was setting, painting the forest in red and gold. Beautiful, but now the shadows between the trees seemed to hold watching eyes. "Do you believe them?" she finally asked as we pulled into the motel parking lot. "About Bigfoot? No," I said automatically. But even as I spoke, I remembered the screams, the impossibly far-thrown rocks, the movement in the trees. "I don't know. Something was out there." In our room, Elena spread a map of the Marble Mountain wilderness across the bed. "We should go back tomorrow," she said, tracing the river with her finger. "But this time, let's bring the video camera." "Ray said they don't like cameras." Eleanor looked up at me. "So you do believe him?" I didn't say that, but whatever it was, person, animal, or whatever, it was real. "Don't you want to know for sure?" She nodded. "Exactly. If there's actually a Bigfoot out there, we could be the ones to prove it." I thought about it. The rational part of my brain said we'd encountered some local playing a prank, or maybe a bear behaving strangely. But another part, a deeper instinct, whispered that we'd brushed against something ancient and unknown. "Okay," I said finally. "We'll go back tomorrow, but we stay together, and at the first sign of trouble we leave. Deal?" "Deal." Elena grinned, excitement replacing the fear in her eyes. That night I dreamed of standing by the river alone. Across the water, something massive moved through the trees, not hiding now, but coming into the open. It stood upright, covered in dark hair, its face almost human but not quite. It raised a hand as big as a dinner plate and pointed at me. Then it opened its mouth and released that same terrible scream. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound still echoing in my ears. Beside me, Eleanor slept peacefully, untroubled by nightmares. I got up and went to the window, pulling back the curtain to look at the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. Something was out there in those trees. Something that had been there long before us and would remain long after. Something that didn't want to be found or filmed or understood. But we were going back anyway, armed with our cameras and our certainty that everything in this world could be captured, categorized, and explained. I thought about Ray's warning, about faces being remembered, and wondered if we were making a terrible mistake. Still, when morning came, we loaded our gear and headed back toward Forks of Salmon. This time, along with our panning equipment, we brought Elena's video camera, my 35mm camera, and a digital voice recorder. We were determined to get proof, to show the world what lurked in the Marble Mountain wilderness. That was almost 20 years ago. Sometimes I still wake up hearing those screams, and sometimes, on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear heavy footsteps circling my house, and I wonder if Ray Blackwater was right, if they really do remember faces, even after all these years. Story 3. I glanced up from adjusting the heater in Mike's car. The clock on the dashboard read 9:07 p.m. I was tired, my muscles ached from a full day of skiing at Big Bear, and I just wanted to get back to base at 29 Palms. The narrow highway stretched ahead of us, empty and dark, cutting through the Mojave like a black ribbon. The headlights caught the reflective dots on the yellow center line, hypnotic in their regularity. "Glad we got in one last ski trip before summer," I said, slouching back in the passenger seat. Mike nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "Yeah, Jack. Sarah's already talking about planning another one before the season ends completely." The silhouette of the abandoned cement factory loomed ahead on our left, a hulking shadow against the night sky. I'd passed it dozens of times on trips between the base and Big Bear, but it always looked eerie at night, like some dead industrial creature. Mike slowed slightly as we approached a curve. That's when it happened. From the brush on the left side of the road, something moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of light and shadow, maybe a deer or a lost cow. But then it stood up. My breath caught in my throat. The thing was massive. 8 feet tall at minimum, standing upright on two legs at the roadside. In the harsh glare of our headlights, I saw its lower half clearly, covered in dark, matted hair or fur, with powerful legs like a man's butt. Wrong, somehow. Larger, stronger. Then it moved. It sprinted across the road about 150 feet ahead of us, covering the entire width of the highway in just 3 enormous strides. Its arms swung in a distinctly human-like motion, but nothing else about it was human. The upper body disappeared into the darkness on the right side of the road before I could fully process what I was seeing. Mike hit the brakes hard. The tires squealed against the asphalt. We jerked forward against our seatbelts, then slammed back into our seats as the car came to a complete stop in the middle of the empty highway. Complete silence filled the car. My ears rang. The headlights illuminated nothing but empty asphalt and scrub brush. I looked at Mike. He looked at me. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "What the hell was that?" I finally asked, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Mike swallowed. "The cement monster," he said flatly, like he was naming something ordinary. Then, without warning, he cranked the wheel hard to the right and pulled a screeching U-turn. "What are you doing?" I demanded, as we accelerated back the way we came. "Going after it," Mike said, his jaw set. "Open the glove box. Sarah's pistol is in there." I popped open the compartment and frantically rummaged through maps, registration papers, and fast food napkins. "Jesus, Mike, you brought your wife's gun skiing. Just find it." My fingers closed around the cold metal of the small .38 revolver. I checked that it was loaded. 6 rounds. Not much if we were going up against whatever that thing was. Mike veered off the highway onto a dirt access road that led toward the cement factory. The car bounced and rattled along the uneven surface, headlights sweeping across the abandoned industrial site. Rusted equipment, crumbling concrete structures, and chain-link fencing with no trespassing signs came into view. "You saw that, right?" I asked, needing confirmation. "That wasn't normal." 8 feet tall, hairy, ran across the road in 3 steps, Mike recited mechanically. "Yeah, I saw it." We crept forward along the dirt road. Every shadow, every bush looked threatening now. The gun felt heavy in my hand. "There," Mike said suddenly, pointing to our right. "Behind that storage tank." I squinted but saw nothing. "I don't see—" "It moved. I swear it moved." Mike stopped the car and killed the engine, but left the headlights on. The abrupt silence was unnerving. The desert at night has its own sounds, wind whistling through abandoned structures, the distant call of coyotes, the creak and groan of cooling metal. But at that moment, everything seemed still. "We should call someone," I said, not taking my eyes off the darkness beyond our headlights. "Who? The sheriff? Hey, we just saw Bigfoot by the old cement factory. They'd breathalyze us on the spot." Mike reached under his seat and pulled out a heavy flashlight. "We're Marines, for Christ's sake. We can handle this." I didn't point out that our combat training didn't cover hairy 8-foot monsters. Instead, I checked the revolver again and got out of the car. The desert night hit me with its characteristic chill. During the day, the Mojave could bake you alive, but at night in March, it was downright cold. My breath formed small clouds in front of my face. We stood listening for a long moment, the only sound our breathing and the tick of the cooling engine. Mike swept the flashlight beam across the abandoned factory grounds. The light caught rusted machinery, piles of concrete rubble, and empty metal drums. No sign of our creature. "Maybe it went inside," Mike suggested, gesturing toward the main building with its broken windows and gaping doorways. "If it did, that's where it stays," I replied. "I'm not going in there." Mike looked at me, then at the building, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, probably right." We spent another 20 minutes searching the perimeter of the property, keeping close to the car, gun and flashlight at the ready. We found nothing. No footprints, no fur, no evidence that anything unusual had crossed our path. Eventually, the cold and common sense prevailed. We should get back to base, I said. We've got duty in the morning. Mike nodded reluctantly. Yeah, let's go. The drive back to 29 Palms was tense. We barely spoke, both scanning the roadside for any movement. I kept the pistol on my lap, though what good a .38 would do against that thing, I couldn't say. We should report this, Mike said, as we approached the outskirts of 29 Palms. Report what? To who? I don't know. Someone. The police. Park rangers. Somebody must be responsible for things like this. I laughed, a short, harsh sound. Things like what? We don't even know what we saw. We know what we saw, Mike insisted. We both saw it. 8 feet tall, covered in hair, moved like a man, but wasn't a man. That's something, Jack. That's something someone should know about. I stared out the window at the dark desert landscape. No one would believe us. They'd think we were drunk or pulling a prank. We rode in silence the rest of the way to the base. As we approached the guard checkpoint, Mike glanced at me. Put the gun away. I tucked the revolver back into the glove compartment just as we pulled up to the gates. The MP checked our IDs with the usual bored efficiency and waved us through. Back in the barracks, I sat on my bunk and tried to process what had happened. The image of that thing standing up, then crossing the road in those impossible strides, kept playing in my mind. I should have been more scared, more shocked. But what struck me even then was how quickly Mike and I had acted, turning around, grabbing the gun, giving chase, like it was procedure for encountering an 8-foot hairy humanoid in the desert, like there was a manual somewhere with a chapter titled, "In Case of Cement Monster." The next morning, I half expected Mike to pretend nothing had happened. Instead, he caught me at breakfast and sat down across from me, his tray clattering on the table. "I've been thinking about last night," he said, leaning forward. "I think it was a bear." I nearly choked on my coffee. A bear? In the Mojave? Walking upright? Bears can walk upright. Not like that. Not 8 feet tall. Not crossing a highway in 3 steps. And bears don't have arms that swing like a person's. Mike pushed his eggs around his plate. Then what was it? I shrugged. I don't know. But it wasn't a bear. We didn't talk about it again for weeks. Life at the base continued its routine. Drills, duties, the occasional weekend pass. Sometimes I'd catch Mike's eye across the mess hall or during PT, and I knew he was thinking about it too. But we didn't discuss it. Then, in late April, Mike showed up at my bunk with a newspaper clipping. "Look at this," he said, thrusting the paper at me. The article was small, tucked away on page 6 of the San Bernardino County Sun. "Hikers report strange sighting near Joshua Tree," read the headline. The piece described how a group of college students on a weekend camping trip had reported seeing a large, unidentifiable animal near the old mining roads that cut through the park. "Could be the same thing," Mike said, sitting on the edge of my bunk. I read the article twice. The description was vague. Large, dark, moved quickly across their path before disappearing into the rocks. Could have been anything. Could have been nothing. "Maybe," I said non-committally, handing the clipping back. "I talked to Williams in communications," Mike continued. "He says there have been stories about something in the Mojave for years. Miners used to talk about it, called it the Old Man of the Mountain or something like that." "Williams believes in UFOs and government mind control," I reminded him. Mike shrugged. "Still." As our enlistments wound down, we occasionally discussed that night. We never reached any conclusions. Mike leaned toward theories involving undiscovered species or prehistoric survivors. I didn't know what to think. All I knew for certain was what I saw. A massive, hair-covered form standing upright, crossing the road with impossible speed and grace. Beyond that, I had no answers. The last time we discussed it was the week before Mike was due to ship out. His enlistment was up, and he was heading back to Idaho with Sarah, We were sitting on the hood of his car, watching the sunset paint the desert in reds and golds. "You know what still gets me about that night?" Mike said, cracking open a beer. "What's that?" "How casual we were about it. I mean, we saw something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. And what did we do? We turned around, grabbed a gun, and went looking for it like we were hunting rabbits." He took a swig of beer. "Then we just went back to normal life, never reported it, never really told anyone. Just occasionally mentioned it to each other like it was some weird dream we both had." I nodded slowly. "I think about that too. It's like the human brain can only handle so much strangeness before it just files it away under things I don't understand and moves on." Mike glanced at me. "So you do believe we saw something?" "I know we saw something. I just don't know what it was." "The cement monster," Mike said with a small smile. "The cement monster," I agreed, clinking my beer against his. After Mike left, I stayed at 29 Palms for another 3 months before my own discharge. I drove that stretch of highway past the cement factory several more times. Each time I slowed down, scanning the roadside, half expecting, half hoping to see something move in the brush. I never did. I've told the story a few times over the years, usually late at night after a few drinks when the conversation turns to strange experiences or things that can't be explained. Most people react with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. Some suggest we saw a bear, a man in a costume, or simply mistook shadows for something more sinister. A few believe without question, eager to add our sighting to their catalogue of supernatural encounters. I don't try to convince anyone either way. I just tell what happened. 2 Marines driving back from a ski trip saw something extraordinary cross the road near an abandoned cement factory in the Mojave Desert. Something 8 feet tall that crossed the highway in 3 strides. Something that looked neither fully human nor fully animal. What strikes me most, even now, 35 years later, isn't the creature itself, but our reaction to it. The way we accepted what we saw, pursued it without hesitation, and then simply returned to our lives. As if encountering an impossible thing was somehow possible. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, whatever it was, moving through the Mojave night, occasionally crossing paths with unsuspecting travelers. I wonder if others have seen it and, like us, filed the experience away under things too strange to dwell on. I wonder if someday someone will find proof, a body, clear footage, irrefutable evidence that the cement monster is real. Until then, all I have is what I know. On a cold March night in 1988, something that shouldn't exist crossed the road in front of our car, and for a brief moment the impossible became possible. Story 4. The morning started like any other hunting day. Cool air filled my lungs as I checked my gear one last time before heading deeper into Azusa Canyon. My 30-06 rifle felt comfortable against my shoulder, a familiar weight I'd carried on countless hunts before. I'd been tracking game since dawn, following promising signs that might lead to deer. My name's Victor Ramirez, and October 23rd, 1987 was the day everything I thought I knew about these woods, about this world, changed forever. I parked my truck at the trailhead around 5:30 a.m. The experimental forest section of Los Angeles County wasn't my usual hunting ground, but I'd heard rumors of good game moving through the area. I dressed in my camo gear, laced up my boots tight and headed in. The morning passed quietly, just the sound of my boots crunching leaves and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. By midday, I'd tracked some promising deer signs to a small stream cutting through a ravine. The water trickled peacefully over smooth rocks. I knelt down to check some fresh tracks, pressed into the mud near the water's edge. Definitely deer, probably from earlier that morning. I followed them upstream for about 20 minutes before losing the trail. The sun beat down through the canopy, warming the day more than expected for late October. I decided to take a break and maybe make a little side money. I spotted a rotting log near the stream bank, perfect scorpion habitat. The pet stores in Pasadena would pay good money for live specimens, and I'd gotten pretty good at catching them over the years. I pulled out my small digging tool and flipped the log, revealing dark, moist earth beneath. I spotted a couple of small scorpions immediately and carefully coaxed them into the plastic container I kept for just this purpose. As I dug a little deeper into the loose soil, something strange happened. The ground vibrated beneath my hands. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, but then it intensified. A rhythmic thumping, almost like footsteps, but much heavier than any human could produce. Whatever made that sound had to be massive. The vibrations grew stronger, coming from uphill. I abandoned the scorpions and stood up, scanning the terrain. My heart rate kicked up a notch. In all my years hunting these canyons, I'd never felt anything like this. Instinct took over. I grabbed my rifle and quickly moved to a large boulder about 15 yards from the stream. The rock formation provided decent cover while giving me visibility upstream. I chambered a round in my .30-06, the metallic click unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The thumping had stopped. I pressed my back against the cool surface of the boulder, controlling my breathing the way I'd learned during my years as a bodyguard. Despite my size, at 6'2" and 240 pounds of mostly muscle, I felt suddenly small. I could bench press 550 pounds at the gym last week, but out here, that meant nothing. The silence stretched for maybe 30 seconds before the thumping resumed, closer now. I raised my rifle, resting it on a small outcropping of the boulder, and peered through the scope. What walked into my field of vision at approximately 45 yards defied explanation. The creature stood upright on two legs. Black, not dark brown like a bear, but pitch black. Its fur or hair was short and dense, covering what appeared to be an extremely muscular body. The proportions were all wrong for any animal I recognized. The shoulders alone must have been 3 feet across, tapering to a more narrow waist. The arms hung longer than a human's would, ending in what looked like hands with visible fingers, not paws. But it was the size that truly struck me. This thing stood at least 8 feet tall, possibly closer to 10. Its mass was impossible to ignore. As a bodybuilder, I developed an eye for estimating weight and muscle mass. This creature had to weigh between 1,300 and 1,700 pounds of what appeared to be solid muscle. Its head sat directly on those massive shoulders with almost no visible neck. From my position, I could make out a face that resembled something between an ape and a human, but with a flatter nose and a pronounced brow ridge. The eyes were the worst part, dark but alert and unmistakably intelligent. My finger trembled on the trigger. The creature stopped moving and turned its head directly toward my hiding spot. It knew I was there. My mouth went dry as paper. I'd been hunting since I was 12 years old, carried a gun professionally for years. But in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that my rifle would do little more than anger this thing. The creature made no aggressive moves. It simply stood there watching me, its chest expanded with deep, visible breaths. Steam rose from its mouth in the cool air. It seemed to be considering me, maybe deciding what to do. I had the distinct impression it wanted to continue on its path, which would take it right past my position. We remained locked in this standoff for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. My arms began to shake from holding the rifle in position for so long. Sweat ran down my back, despite the cool temperature. The creature took a step forward. The ground actually shook. I instinctively tightened my grip on the rifle, but something told me shooting would be the worst possible decision. This thing wasn't threatening me, at least not yet. It was just trying to pass by. I made a decision that went against every hunting instinct I'd developed over decades in the woods. Slowly, I lowered my rifle. The creature's eyes followed the movement. Then, keeping my gaze locked on it, I began backing away, step by careful step. The creature remained motionless as I retreated. When I'd put about 60 yards between us, it resumed its course, crossing the spot where I'd been hiding. Its movements were surprisingly fluid for something so massive. It walked with a straight back, not hunched over like a bear, walking on hind legs. The arms swung naturally, not touching the ground. Once it passed my former position, I continued my retreat, circling wide around where it had headed. After putting enough distance between us and making sure it wasn't following, I turned and ran. Not a controlled jog, but an all-out sprint fueled by pure adrenaline. I ran through the forest, barely registering the branches that whipped at my face. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't slow down until I spotted my truck through the trees. I reached the vehicle, fumbled with the keys, and finally managed to unlock the door. I threw my rifle onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and peeled out of the dirt parking area, spitting gravel behind me. Only when I hit the main road did I ease off the gas. My hands shook so badly I had to pull over. I sat there, engine idling, trying to process what I'd just seen. Nothing in my experience, not as a hunter, not as a bodyguard, not in all my years in the outdoors, prepared me for that encounter. I drove straight home to my place in Glendora. My wife Karen was at work, so I had the house to myself. I locked the doors, something I rarely bothered with in our neighborhood, and poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey. The alcohol burned going down, but did nothing to erase the image of that creature from my mind. That night, when Karen got home, I couldn't bring myself to tell her. What would I say? That I saw Bigfoot? That some kind of monster roamed the canyons just miles from our home? She'd think I was crazy, or that I'd been drinking on my hunting trip. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent eyes staring back at me. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed to report what I'd seen, if only to warn others who might be in those woods. I called the local ranger station first. The conversation went about as well as expected. Forest Service, Ranger Wilson speaking. Hi, my name is Victor Ramirez. I need to report something I saw yesterday in Azusa Canyon, near the experimental forest section. Go ahead, sir. I hesitated, then decided to just say it straight. I saw a creature in the woods. Not a bear or a mountain lion. This thing was walking upright, stood about 8 to 10 feet tall, completely black, and looked like nothing I've ever seen before. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Sir, are you reporting a Bigfoot sighting? The ranger's tone had changed to something between amusement and concern. I'm not calling it that. I'm just telling you what I saw. This thing was real. It made the ground shake when it walked. Had you been drinking yesterday, Mr. Ramirez? No, I was hunting. Listen, I've been in those woods my entire life. I know every animal native to this area. This wasn't any of them. I'll make a note of your report, sir. Is there anything else? I could tell he was humoring me. No, just thought someone should know. I hung up, feeling frustrated and foolish. Next, I called the local sheriff's department with similar results. By the end of the day, I'd given up trying to report what I'd seen. No one was going to believe me without evidence, and I hadn't thought to take photos, not that I'd had time anyway. A week passed. I cleaned my rifle, but didn't put it back in its case. Instead, I kept it loaded and propped in the corner of our bedroom. Karen noticed, of course. Vic, what's going on with you? You've been jumpy all week. You're not sleeping, and now you've got a loaded gun in our bedroom. Talk to me. I sat her down and told her everything. To her credit, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took my hand. Do you believe what you saw? Really believe it? Yes, I answered without hesitation. It was real, Karen. I was stone-cold sober in broad daylight. She nodded slowly. Then I believe you saw something. I don't know what it was, but I know you're not a liar or crazy. Her acceptance helped, but it didn't erase what happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd glimpsed something humans weren't supposed to see, something that existed in the shadows of our world, just out of sight. The next weekend came, and for the first time in 20 years, I didn't go hunting. My gear stayed packed away. I told my hunting buddies I wasn't feeling well. The truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of going back into those woods. What if I encountered that thing again? What if next time it wasn't so passive? 2 weeks after the encounter, curiosity got the better of me. I started researching similar sightings in the area. To my surprise, there were several reports from Azusa Canyon and the surrounding mountains dating back decades. Most were dismissed as bear sightings or hoaxes, but some contained details that matched exactly what I'd seen: the size, the color, the intelligent eyes. I reached out to one of the other witnesses, a man named Frank Gutierrez, who'd reported a sighting in 1982. We met at a diner in Pasadena. Frank was in his 60s, a retired electrician with no reason to make up stories. "They all think we're crazy," he said after we'd exchanged stories. "But I know what I saw, same as you. That thing was watching me for nearly 10 minutes before it moved on." "Did you ever go back to that area?" I asked. Frank shook his head emphatically. "Never, not even in a car. Some things you see change you forever. That was one of them." I understood exactly what he meant. Months passed. I sold most of my hunting equipment, but kept my rifle. I couldn't bring myself to part with it, though I never used it again. Karen suggested we move, maybe to Arizona where her sister lived, but I refused. Running away wouldn't erase what happened. 1 year after the encounter, I drove back to the trailhead where it all began. I didn't hike in, just sat in my truck looking at the forest edge. The trees seemed darker somehow, hiding secrets I hadn't been aware of before that day. A forest ranger pulled up beside me, probably wondering why someone was sitting alone in a parked vehicle. I recognized him from his nameplate. Wilson, the same ranger I'd spoken to on the phone. "Everything okay, sir?" he asked, approaching my window. "Just thinking," I replied. "I was here last year, saw something in these woods." Recognition flashed across his face. "You're the guy who called about the tall creature. Ramirez, right?" I nodded. He looked around to make sure no one else was within earshot, then leaned closer to my window. "Between you and me, you're not the only one. We get a couple reports every year, but we're instructed not to document them officially." My heart raced. "You've seen it too?" He shook his head. "Not personally, but I've talked to enough credible people that I can't just dismiss it. Whatever's out there, it's been here a long time." "Does anyone study these reports? Try to find this thing?" "Not officially. The Forest Service doesn't want the attention or the liability. Imagine the circus if we acknowledge something like that might exist." I understood then that my encounter would never be officially recognized. The creature I saw would remain in a gray area, not acknowledged by authorities, but known to those who'd had the misfortune of coming face to face with it. I never hunted again after that day. Couldn't bring myself to enter the deep woods, even with a weapon. Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of the world. For 40 years, I'd believed I knew what existed in these mountains. In one afternoon, that certainty was shattered. It's been 5 years now since that day in Azusa Canyon. I still live in Glendora with Karen, though we talk about moving more often. Sometimes at night, I hear heavy thumping in my dreams, rhythmic footsteps approaching through dense forest. I wake up sweating, reaching for a rifle I no longer keep by the bed. I don't know what I encountered that day. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, an undiscovered primate. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it exists, walking these canyons, while most people remain completely unaware. Sometimes I envy them, those who can hike and camp and hunt without knowing what shares these woods with them. Other times I feel strangely privileged. How many people go their entire lives without seeing something truly inexplicable? I've glimpsed behind the curtain of our ordinary world. I've seen something that science says shouldn't exist. I just wish I could forget those eyes, intelligent, aware, and utterly inhuman, staring back at me from the shadows of Azusa Canyon. Story 5. I was never one to believe in fairy tales or monsters. 70 years of living teaches you what's real and what ain't. But what happened that evening at Little River State Beach changed everything I thought I knew about this world. My name's Thomas Reynolds. My wife Sarah and I had been looking forward to this camping trip with my brother Everett and the rest of the family for months. We'd chosen the spot north of McKinleyville in Humboldt County because I'd heard the surf fishing was good, and at my age, sitting with a line in the water is about as exciting as life gets. Or so I thought. It was a perfect late afternoon. The sun was starting to sink, casting long shadows across the sand. The coastal air had that salt tang smell that always reminds me why I love the ocean. We'd been fishing for a few hours and caught enough for a decent dinner. My knees were aching from standing in the surf, but it was the good kind of ache that comes from doing something you enjoy. "Looks like we got a feast," Everett said, poking at the cooler where we'd stored our catch. My brother was 4 years younger than me, but looked 10 years older. Hard living and 3 failed marriages will do that to a man. "Nothing tastes better than fish you caught yourself," I replied, collapsing into one of the folding chairs at our picnic table. Sarah was busy setting out paper plates and plastic forks, my wife of 48 years, still organized as the day I met her. Her silver hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and despite pushing 70 herself, she moved with more energy than folks half her age. "Thomas, did you bring the tartar sauce from the cooler in the truck?" she asked. I thought Everett was getting it. My brother raised his hands. "Don't look at me. I was in charge of the beer." Sarah sighed and shook her head. "I'll go get it. You two rest your old bones." The sun had nearly disappeared behind the horizon, leaving just enough light to see by. Our campsite was set up about 50 yards from the water's edge, with our trucks parked another 30 yards behind us toward the highway. The beach was nearly empty at this hour, just a couple walking their dog way down the shoreline. I was just about to close my eyes for a quick rest when I heard Sarah's voice. "Thomas, who's that?" I looked up to see her standing, hands shielding her eyes, staring toward the highway. "Where?" I asked, not seeing anything unusual. "There," she pointed. "Coming from the road. Walking fast." That's when I saw it. A figure moving rapidly from the direction of the highway, heading straight for the ocean. At first I thought it was just some hiker or beachgoer, but something about the way it moved didn't sit right. "Everett, you seeing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My brother was already on his feet. "What the hell is that?" As the figure got closer, my heart started hammering against my ribs. This wasn't right. This wasn't right at all. "Sarah, get behind me," I said, standing up despite my protesting knees. The figure was about 30 feet away now, moving with purpose. And it was big. Not just tall, but massive. In the fading light, I could make out that it was completely covered in hair. Not clothing, but actual hair, like a bear or an ape. "Jesus Christ," Everett muttered. "That ain't human." He was right. Whatever this thing was, it stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms too long for its frame. I've been a big man all my life, and Everett's no small fry either. Between us, we probably weigh close to 500 pounds. This thing had to be at least 600, maybe more. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen, powerful strides eating up the distance between the highway and the ocean. And it was close enough now that I could make out its face, if you could call it that. It was flat and wide, with a pronounced brow ridge and a mouth that seemed too small for its enormous head. The eyes were dark, deep-set, and entirely focused on the water ahead. The strangest thing was, it paid us no mind whatsoever. We were standing there, frozen in shock, and this massive hairy creature just charged past us like we weren't even there. "What is it doing?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. We watched, stunned, as the creature reached the water's edge and didn't even pause. It charged straight into the Pacific Ocean, powerful arms cutting through the waves. Within seconds it was chest deep in the water, then shoulder deep, and then it disappeared entirely beneath the surface. For a long moment none of us spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic crashing of waves on the shore. "Did that just happen?" I finally managed to say, my mouth bone dry. Everett nodded slowly. "Unless we all had the same hallucination." Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. "It went into the water. Where did it go?" I squinted out at the darkening ocean, but there was no sign of the creature. No head breaking the surface, no disturbance in the waves. It was as if it had never existed. "I need to see," I said, suddenly determined. I went to our camping gear and grabbed the high-beam flashlight I always pack for emergencies. "I'm going to check the beach." "Thomas, don't," Sarah pleaded. "What if it comes back?" "It won't," I said, though I had no reason to believe that. "I just need to make sure I'm not losing my mind." Everett grabbed his own flashlight. "I'm coming with you." We walked cautiously to the water's edge, sweeping our flashlight beams across the sand. And there they were. Footprints. Not human footprints, not bear tracks, but something else entirely. They were enormous, easily 2 feet long and proportionally wide, with what looked like 5 distinct toes at the front. The depth of the impressions in the sand suggested something of immense weight had made them. "You seen this?" I asked Everett, my voice barely steady. He nodded, his face pale in the beam of my flashlight. "They go right into the water." We followed the tracks backward toward the highway. They came straight from the road, just as we'd seen the creature do. No hesitation, no wandering. Whatever this thing was, it had a purpose. "What do you think it was?" Everett asked as we walked back to our campsite, where Sarah was waiting anxiously. "I don't know," I admitted. "Bigfoot, some kind of ape. Hell, I don't even know if I believe in that stuff." "Well, you better start believing," he replied grimly, "because we all saw it." Sarah had gathered our nieces and nephews at the picnic table. They'd been down the beach a ways and missed the whole thing. Part of me was glad they hadn't seen it. Kids don't need that kind of nightmare fuel. "Did you find anything?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. I nodded. "Footprints, big ones." "What was it doing? Why did it go in the water?" I shook my head. "I don't know. Maybe it was hunting for something." Everett let out a nervous laugh. "Or maybe it was committing suicide. Decided it had enough of being a cryptid." I shot him a look. No one was in the mood for jokes. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. The night had fully settled in now, the beach illuminated only by our campfire and the distant lights from the highway. "We should report this," Sarah finally said. "Report what?" I asked. "That we saw Bigfoot go for a swim. They'll think we're crazy." "There are footprints, Thomas. Evidence." I sighed. "They'll wash away with the tide, and even if they don't, who's going to believe 3 old-timers claiming they saw some giant hairy beast charge into the ocean?" "I don't care if they believe us," she insisted. "It should be documented." She was right, of course. Sarah usually is. If this thing was real, and the evidence of our eyes and those footprints suggested it was, then people should know about it. We decided to stay the night rather than pack up in the dark. None of us slept much. Every sound made me jolt awake, half expecting to see that massive figure looming outside our tent. But the night passed without incident. In the morning, we went back to check the footprints. As I'd feared, the high tide had washed most of them away, but a few deeper impressions remained further up the beach. Everett took photos with his phone, though I doubted they'd convince anyone who wasn't already inclined to believe. We packed up our gear in silence. The excitement of the fishing trip had been completely overshadowed by what we'd witnessed. As I was loading the last cooler into the truck, Everett came up beside me. "You think it drowned itself?" he asked in a low voice, echoing his macabre joke from the night before. I shrugged. Or maybe it can breathe underwater. Hell, Everett, I don't know what to think anymore. You ever coming back here to fish? I looked out at the ocean, sparkling innocently in the morning sun. It seemed impossible that just hours ago, something so strange and terrifying had disappeared beneath those waves. No, I said firmly. I think I'm done fishing in California. We drove to the ranger station before leaving. The young ranger on duty listened politely to our story, taking notes and promising to look into it. But I could see the skepticism in his eyes. 3 old folks claiming to have seen Bigfoot. What else was new in Northern California? The drive home was quiet. Sarah held my hand across the center console, giving it an occasional squeeze. You okay? She asked after we'd been on the road for an hour. Just processing, I replied. 70 years on this earth, and I thought I'd seen it all. Turns out I didn't know a damn thing. Do you think there are more of them? Her voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying fear. I don't know. Maybe. Probably. I took a deep breath. But it didn't hurt us, Sarah. It could have. But it didn't even look at us. It was on a mission. To the ocean. She shuddered. What's in the ocean, Thomas? I had no answer for her. The vastness of the Pacific suddenly seemed more mysterious and frightening than ever before. What could be out there that would call to a creature like that? What might be waiting beneath those waves? We made it home by nightfall. Our little house in rural Oregon had never looked so welcoming. As I unlocked the front door, Sarah paused on the porch, looking up at the night sky. We're not going to tell people about this, are we? Besides the ranger, I mean. I considered her question. Would you believe us if you hadn't seen it yourself? She smiled sadly. No, I'd think we were crazy or lying. Exactly. I put my arm around her shoulders. This stays between us and Everett's family. Some things you just have to see to believe. That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying the image of that massive creature charging into the ocean. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd witnessed something not meant for human eyes, a glimpse into a world that exists alongside ours, but remains hidden from view. Before drifting off to sleep, I made a decision. I'd never go back to that beach, but I would start paying more attention to the world around me. If creatures like that existed, what else might be out there, just beyond the edge of our understanding? In the morning, I checked the local news. Nothing about strange sightings or mysterious creatures. Life went on as if nothing had happened. And maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some experiences unshared. But I know what I saw. And whenever I look at the ocean now, I can't help but wonder what's really out there beneath the surface. And more importantly, when will it decide to emerge? Story 6. I was 10 years old when it first came to the cottages, summer of 1953. The sweet, humid air of northern Indiana hung over our family property in Winemac like a warm blanket. My cousins and I had been running between the 5 riverside cabins all afternoon, playing tag in the long shadows cast by the surrounding oak and maple trees. Dad had built these cottages after returning from the war, sturdy wooden structures with screened-in porches facing the lazy brown river. The Blackwood family land stretched nearly a mile along the water, isolated enough that we rarely saw anyone but relatives during our summer gatherings. That evening, I was inside our cabin helping Mum set the table when the screaming started. Not normal play screaming. This was different, primal, terrified. Dad dropped his newspaper and bolted through the door, his chair tipping backward with a clatter. I ran after him. The screams came from behind cabin 3, where my 3 cousins, all girls between 8 and 12, had been playing near the tree line. "Get back inside!" Dad shouted over his shoulder, but I ignored him, my bare feet pounding across the damp grass. The sight that met us sent ice through my veins. My cousins huddled together, faces pale and twisted in fear, pointing toward the woods. It touched me, it touched me. Sarah, the youngest, sobbed, clutching her arm like it burned. I followed their pointing fingers and saw it. About 50 yards away, a tall figure walked upright toward the trees, not walked, lumbered, each movement deliberate, swinging arms covered in dark, matted hair. It stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, its broad shoulders hunched forward. "Jesus Christ," Dad whispered. His hand instinctively reached for my shoulder, pulling me slightly behind him. Uncle Bill emerged from his cabin, rifle in hand. "What in God's name is that?" he called out, raising the gun to his shoulder. The creature never turned or acknowledged us. It just continued its steady pace toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows. Uncle Bill's finger hovered over the trigger. He had a clear shot. "Don't," Dad said firmly. "Nathan, what the hell are you talking about? That thing touched Sarah." Dad, Nathan Blackwood, kept his eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had vanished. "We don't know what it is. Could be human." "That wasn't human," I whispered, but only Dad heard me. Later, as the adults gathered the children inside cabin 1, Sarah insisted through hiccuping sobs that the creature had only one eye, a big yellow eye in the middle of its face. The other girls disagreed, saying it had 2 eyes that glowed like a cat's. But they all agreed on the smell, like rotten eggs and dead animals. Dad stayed up all night on the porch with Uncle Bill's rifle across his lap. Nothing came back, but sleep didn't visit any of us that night. The next morning we found massive footprints in the soft dirt behind cabin 3, 18 inches long, with what looked like claws at the end of each toe. Dad took photographs, made plaster casts, and reported it to the local sheriff, who smirked and suggested it was probably just a bear walking funny. But bears don't walk exclusively on 2 legs for 50 yards, and bears don't have feet shaped almost like human hands. That was the summer the locks were added to all cabin doors. The summer nighttime activities ended at dusk. The summer I learned monsters weren't just in storybooks. 10 years passed. I grew up, the incident fading to an unsettling memory we rarely discussed outside the family. Sure, every few years someone in town would claim to have seen something strange in the woods around Winemark, but nothing directly affected the Blackwood property again. Until 1963. I was 15 then, gangly and restless. On a warm July night I sneaked out of the cabin after my parents fell asleep. Not to go far, just to sit by the river and escape the suffocating heat inside. The suspension bridge that connected our property to the road on the other side creaked in the gentle breeze, its metal cables catching the moonlight. I sat on the riverbank, tossing pebbles into the dark water, listening to the chorus of frogs and crickets. Around midnight, the normal night sounds suddenly stopped. Complete silence fell over the riverside. The hairs on my arms stood up. A rustling noise came from behind the cabins, heavy footsteps on dry leaves. My first thought was that Dad had discovered I was missing and come looking. I stood up, brushing dirt from my jeans, ready to receive the lecture about safety and responsibility. But the footsteps were too heavy for Dad, too deliberate. I crept between cabins 4 and 5, peering around the corner toward the woods. That's when I saw it emerging from the tree line, the same dark, hair-covered figure from my childhood, unmistakable, taller than any man I'd ever seen, its body covered in shaggy black hair that hung in matted clumps. My body went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature hadn't noticed me yet, its massive head swinging from side to side as it walked toward the river. Toward me. I finally broke free from my paralysis and ran back to our cabin. I crashed through the screen door, waking Dad with urgent whispers. "It's back. The thing from the woods. It's outside right now." Dad grabbed his glasses from the nightstand and followed me to the screened porch. We crouched in darkness, watching as the creature emerged between the cabins and headed toward the river. "Get the rifle," I whispered. Dad shook his head. his eyes never leaving the figure. Just watch. Under the outdoor floodlights we'd installed after the first incident, we could see it clearly now. Its movements were fluid despite its bulk. The dark hair covered every visible part of its body except for patches of leathery skin on its face and hands. Then the smell hit us. Even through the screen, the stench was overwhelming, like roadkill left in the summer sun for days, mixed with something sulfuric and rotten. I gagged, covering my mouth with my t-shirt. The creature paused at the riverbank, then turned toward the suspension bridge. As it approached the narrow walkway, it dropped to all fours, crawling across the bridge with surprising agility. Our dog tank, a huge German shepherd, suddenly burst through the screen door, ripping a hole in the mesh as he charged after the creature, barking furiously. "Tank, no!" Dad shouted, but it was too late. The dog chased the creature across the bridge and into the darkness beyond. For 20 minutes, we heard barking and then yelping from the woods across the river. Dad wanted to go after Tank, but Mom, awake now and terrified, begged him to stay inside. Around 3 a.m., Tank limped back across the bridge. Deep gashes ran along his side, his muzzle was bloodied, and patches of fur were missing from his back. The vet later said they looked like claw marks, but larger and deeper than any wild animal native to Indiana should be able to inflict. Dad contacted the sheriff again. This time, they sent 2 deputies who took statements and searched the area half-heartedly. They found broken branches on the far side of the river and unusual tracks in the mud, but ultimately filed it as an unidentified animal encounter. Uncle Bill, who'd been staying in cabin 2, insisted on setting up traps in the woods. Dad refused. "Whatever it is," he said, "it hasn't tried to hurt any of us. It seems to be passing through. Let's leave it be." The argument nearly came to blows. Uncle Bill called Dad a coward. Dad called Uncle Bill a hothead who'd shoot at shadows. In the end, Dad prevailed. It was his property after all. We installed more lights, added bolt locks to all doors and windows, but deep down I knew locks wouldn't matter if that thing decided to come inside. Life went on. I graduated high school, then college. Got married to Elaine, a girl from 2 counties over. We had a daughter, Jenny. Every summer, we'd return to the Blackwood cottages for at least 2 weeks, maintaining the family tradition. Dad grew older, greyer, but still spent every summer at the river. He'd sit on the porch of cabin 1 in his rocking chair, watching the tree line while pretending to read his newspaper. Waiting, maybe, though he never said for what. In the summer of 1976, Jenny was 6 years old. A curious, fearless child with her mother's auburn hair and the Blackwood blue eyes. We never told her about the creature. No sense in giving her nightmares about something that hadn't been seen in 13 years. We were staying in cabin 3, the same one near where the first sighting occurred. Elaine and I took the main bedroom, and Jenny slept on a small bed in the adjoining room with the door kept open between us. On our 5th night there, I awoke to Jenny standing beside our bed, her small hand on my arm. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There was a monster." I sat up, instantly alert. "What kind of monster, honey? A bad dream?" She shook her head, her eyes wide. "A big, hairy monster. It was at my door looking at me." My blood ran cold. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and moved quietly to her room, heart hammering in my chest. Empty. The window was still locked from the inside. I swept the beam around the small room, then toward the doorway leading to the main cabin area. On the wooden floor just outside her bedroom door were 3 damp marks, massive footprints that hadn't been there when we went to bed. "It was yellow, Daddy," Jenny said from behind me. "Yellow and hairy, and it smelled really bad. Like when that skunk sprayed under Grandpa's porch." I gathered Jenny in my arms and woke Elaine. We spent the rest of the night in our bed, Jenny between us, the shotgun I'd brought from home, leaning against the wall within arm's reach. At first light, I examined the footprints more carefully. They were similar to the ones I remembered from childhood, enormous, with distinct toe impressions that seemed almost hand-like. They led from the main cabin door to Jenny's bedroom and back out again. Whatever made them had stood in her doorway watching my daughter sleep, then left without harming her. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. All locks were intact, all windows secured. I went to cabin 1, where Dad was already awake, drinking coffee on the porch. "It came back," I said, dropping into the chair beside him. He nodded slowly. "I heard something last night, figured it was a raccoon. It was in our cabin, stood in Jenny's doorway watching her." Dad's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "Was she?" "She's fine. Said it was yellow and hairy." Dad turned to face me. "Yellow? The others were dark, black or brown." I shrugged. "Kids mix things up. Maybe it was the moonlight." "Maybe." Dad stared out at the tree line. "Or maybe there's more than one." We gathered the family for a meeting that morning. Uncle Bill, now in his 60s, but still sharp as ever, wanted to organize a hunting party. Aunt Meredith suggested calling in experts, university researchers or wildlife officials. My cousins, all grown with families of their own now, were divided. Dad raised his hands for silence. "This is the third time in 23 years something has visited without harming anyone. If it wanted to hurt us, it's had plenty of opportunities." "It got into a locked cabin, Nathan," Uncle Bill argued. "What happens when it decides to do more than look?" In the end, we compromised. We would stay, but children would sleep with parents. 2 men would keep watch each night. We installed battery-powered alarms on all doors and windows. For the remaining week of our stay, nothing happened. No sightings, no unusual sounds. But every night the normal forest noises would go silent for exactly 17 minutes, starting at 2:43 a.m., as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. On our last night, Dad and I sat on the porch of cabin 1, rifle across his lap, shotgun across mine. "I've been thinking about this for 23 years, Dad said quietly. "What they are, where they come from." "And?" He shook his head. "Some things aren't meant for us to understand. This land was here long before us. We'll be here long after." "That's awfully philosophical for a practical man like you," I said. Dad smiled faintly. "Maybe. But I made the right call not shooting that day. I feel that in my bones." The wind shifted, bringing a familiar putrid smell from the direction of the river. We both tensed, raising our weapons slightly. Through the darkness beyond the floodlight's reach, we heard the soft splash of something large crossing the shallow part of the river downstream from the bridge. Heavy footsteps receded into the forest on the far bank. Dad lowered his rifle. "Goodbye," he whispered toward the darkness. We never saw it again after that summer. Dad passed away in 1982, the property divided among his children. I kept cabin 1 and 3. The others were sold off over time as the family spread across the country. Jenny grew up with no memory of her nighttime visitor, or if she remembered, she never mentioned it. But each summer when I return to the cabins, I sit on the porch at night, watching the tree line. And sometimes, just before 3 a.m., the forest goes completely silent for exactly 17 minutes. I don't know what visited the Blackwood family those 3 times over 23 years. I don't know if it or they still wander the woods of northern Indiana, but I keep the rifle cleaned and loaded, just in case. Story 7. I checked my watch one more time. 11:42 p.m. The night air bit at my face as I zipped my jacket up to my chin. The parking lot was empty except for my beat-up Chevy Blazer and Mike's Jeep Cherokee. 4 beams of light cut through the darkness as we adjusted our headlamps. "Everyone got their gear?" I asked, shouldering my pack. "All set, Jason," Tom replied, clicking his lamp on and off to test the battery. Mike and Dave nodded, their breath fogging in the cold Oregon air. The trailhead sign for Mount Hood stood before us, barely visible in the dim moonlight filtering through the clouds. "Remember, we rest at Illumination Rock, then push for the summit before dawn," I said, trying to hide the excitement in my voice. I'd been hiking this mountain since I was 12, but a midnight summit was different. Special. Dave checked his map. "That's about 4 hours of hiking, right?" "More or less," I answered. "Depends on the conditions." What we didn't know then was that nothing would go as planned that night in July 1982. Nothing at all. The first hour passed in relative silence, each of us focused on the narrow beam of our headlamps illuminating the trail. The crunch of our boots on the volcanic soil and our labored breathing were the only sounds. Mount Hood loomed above us, a massive shadow against the night sky. "How you holding up, Tom?" I called back to our least experienced member. "Legs are burning, but I'm good," he responded between heavy breaths. The trail steepened as we climbed higher. Patches of snow appeared, remnants of last winter that even July's heat couldn't fully melt at this elevation. By 1:30 a.m. we'd reached Illumination Rock, a distinctive formation jutting out from the mountainside. We paused there, drinking water and eating energy bars. Mike pointed upward. "Look at those stars, man." Above us, the night sky had cleared, revealing thousands of stars spread across the blackness. The Milky Way stretched in a brilliant band. Below us, the lights of Government Camp twinkled in the distance. "Hard to believe we were down there just a couple hours ago," Dave said. I nodded, then checked my watch. "We should move. Summit's still about an hour and a half away." We continued upward, our pace slower now as the trail grew steeper and the air thinner. By 2:15 a.m., we were approximately 500 feet below the summit. The temperature had dropped considerably, and I could feel the sweat on my back starting to freeze. "Let's take 5, I called out, noticing Dave was struggling a bit. We found a relatively flat area and dropped our packs. I pulled out my thermos and poured steaming coffee into the cap, passing it around. "Almost there," I said, pointing up at the summit silhouette. "Just one more push," and that's when we heard it. The first scream cut through the night air like a knife, long, high-pitched, and absolutely not human. It echoed off the mountainside, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We froze, coffee forgotten, eyes darting around the darkness beyond our headlamp beams. "What the hell was—" Mike started to say when the second scream interrupted him. This one was longer, more sustained, and if possible, even more blood-curdling than the first. It came from directly above us, from the ridge leading to the summit. "Turn off the lights," I whispered urgently. 4 beams clicked off, plunging us into darkness broken only by starlight and the faint glow of snow. We huddled together, hardly daring to breathe. Then came the growl. I've heard mountain lions. I've heard bears. This was neither. This was something that made my entire body lock up with primal fear. The sound was so powerful it vibrated through my chest cavity, a deep, thundering growl that rose in pitch and volume until it sounded like a fire station alarm blaring across the mountain's face. "Run!" I whispered, grabbing my pack. "Now!" We didn't need to be told twice. Headlamps flicking back on, we abandoned our summit attempt and began half jogging, half sliding down the trail we'd just ascended. No one spoke. The only sounds were our labored breathing and the scrape of our boots on rock and snow. After 5 minutes of panicked descent, Dave stopped suddenly. "Listen!" We halted, straining our ears. Nothing. "It's not following us," Mike said, relief evident in his voice. "Keep moving," I insisted. "I'm not stopping until we hit the highway." And we didn't. We practically ran down that mountain, stumbling and sliding, driven by fear of whatever had made those ungodly sounds. By the time we reached the parking lot, the sky in the east was just beginning to lighten. We piled into our vehicles without discussion and drove straight to the all-night diner in Government Camp. Sitting in that brightly lit booth, hands wrapped around coffee mugs, we finally began to process what had happened. Mountain lion, Dave suggested half-heartedly. Tom shook his head. No way, that was no cat. Mike looked at me. Jason, you've been on this mountain more than any of us. Ever heard anything like that before? I hesitated, then said, no, but... I stopped, unsure whether to continue. But what? Dave prompted. I took a deep breath. 2 years ago, I saw something up there that I never told anyone about, except Billy Harmon, who was with me. They leaned in, waiting. We were hiking in that same area, though lower down, maybe a mile from Illumination Rock. It was daytime, around noon. The memory of that day in 1980 flooded back as I spoke. The sunshine, the snow-capped peak above us, the sense of freedom that always came with being on the mountain. Billy and I had been taking a break, sitting on a fallen log and passing a canteen back and forth. The forest around us was quiet, except for the occasional bird call. Hey, check that out, Billy had said, pointing across a small ravine to a clearing about 300 feet away. Someone's sitting over there. I squinted against the sunlight. Sure enough, there was what appeared to be a man sitting on a stump, facing in our direction. Hello, I called out, waving. No response. Billy stood up. Let's go say hi. Maybe they know if there's a better route up from here. We shouldered our packs and made our way toward the figure. About halfway there, Billy grabbed my arm. Jason, he said, his voice suddenly tight. That's not a person. I focused more carefully on the figure. Billy was right. What I'd taken for a man in a dark jacket was actually something entirely covered in dark brown hair. It was sitting upright on the stump, watching us intently. The proportions were all wrong. Shoulders too broad, arms too long, head set directly on those massive shoulders with little visible neck. What the hell is that? Billy whispered. I don't know, I answered. My heart was pounding, but curiosity overcame my fear. Hey! I yelled, waving my arms over my head. The thing moved slightly, tilting what passed for its head. It seemed to be studying us, assessing. Billy tugged at my sleeve. Let's go, now. Wait, I said. I want to see what it does. After a few more moments of this strange standoff, the creature stood up. Even from 300 feet away, I could tell it was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It turned slowly and walked into the tree line, its gait oddly smooth and rolling. It's gone, Billy said, relief evident in his voice. Let's get out of here. But I was already moving forward. Come on, I urged. Let's see where it went. Are you crazy? Billy hissed, but he followed me anyway. We approached the stump cautiously. It was larger than I'd thought, about 2 feet in diameter. What caught my attention were the metal survey spikes driven into the center. They had been flattened, as if struck repeatedly with a sledgehammer. Look at these, I said, pointing. These are solid metal. Billy was more interested in the ground around the stump. Jason, he called, his voice shaking. Look at these prints. The footprints were unmistakable. Enormous impressions in the soft earth, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They led from the stump straight into the tree line. Against all better judgment, we followed them. About 20 yards into the forest, the tracks led us to a small clearing beneath young fir trees. There we found something that made my blood run cold. An enormous depression in the ground and undergrowth, approximately 15 feet long by 8 feet wide. The soil and plants were compressed as if something of tremendous weight had been lying there for an extended period. The edges of the depression were smooth, with no footprints visible inside it. It's a bed, Billy said in disbelief. Whatever that thing was, this is where it sleeps. We didn't stick around to investigate further. We hiked out as quickly as possible, and by unspoken agreement, never mentioned what we'd seen to anyone. Until now. As I finished my story, the diner booth fell silent. Outside, the sun had fully risen, bathing Mount Hood in golden morning light. Why didn't you ever report it? Tom finally asked. I shrugged. And say what? That we saw a giant hairy thing in the woods? Who'd believe that? Bigfoot, Mike said quietly. Dave snorted. Come on, man. What would you call it then? Mike shot back. Those screams we heard tonight, that was no animal I know. And what Jason's describing, the size, the hair, the bed in the forest, what else fits? Could have been a bear, Dave suggested, but there was doubt in his voice. I shook my head. Bears don't flatten metal spikes with their weight, and they don't walk upright like that. We fell silent again, each lost in our own thoughts. The waitress refilled our coffee cups, eyeing our mud-splattered hiking clothes with curiosity. So what now? Tom asked eventually. Nothing, I said firmly. We don't go back up there at night, at least not to that area. Mike leaned forward. But don't you want to know for sure? We could go back in daylight, maybe with cameras. No, I cut him off. Listen to me. Whatever's up there, it left us alone last night. It could have come after us, but it didn't. I say we return the favor. Jason's right, Billy said. Some things are better left alone. The four of us finished our breakfast in silence. We paid our bill and stepped outside into the morning air. Mount Hood loomed above us, serene and beautiful in the daylight. See you guys next weekend? Dave asked as we reached our cars. Johnson Creek fishing trip? We all nodded, relieved at the prospect of flat ground and flowing water. No midnight hikes, though, Tom added with a nervous laugh. As I drove home that morning, windows down and radio playing, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror at Mount Hood, growing smaller in the distance. I'd spent most of my life on that mountain, thought I knew every trail, every rock formation, every hidden valley. But that night had shown me that Mount Hood held secrets I'd never understand. 2 years have passed since that night in 1982. I still hike Mount Hood, but never after sunset and never alone. Sometimes, when I reach a certain elevation, I feel eyes on me, watching, assessing. I don't wave anymore. I don't call out. I just keep my head down and keep moving. Because I know now what the old-timers in government camp have always known. We're guests on that mountain, temporary visitors in a territory that belongs to something else, something that's been there much longer than us and will remain long after we're gone, something that doesn't want to be found. Story 8. I hadn't wanted to come camping, not really. But Dad insisted it would be good for all of us to reconnect with nature after moving to Charlton County last winter. Mum packed enough food for a week, even though we were only staying 3 nights, and my younger siblings, Emma and Caleb, wouldn't shut up about fishing and catching frogs the whole drive out. It was July 1972, hot as blazes in southern Georgia. The humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, making my t-shirt stick to my back before we'd even finished setting up the tents. Our campsite sat about 50 yards from a canal that fed into the Okefenokee swamp. Dad said it was perfect, close enough to water for fishing, but far enough to keep the mosquitoes at bay. He was wrong about the mosquitoes. That first day passed like most family outings. Dad barking orders about the proper way to hammer tent stakes, Mum fussing over the cooler organization, Emma and Caleb running wild through the trees. Being 14, I tried my best to look bored with everything, but truthfully the woods had a strange quiet that got under my skin from the beginning. Jason, go collect some firewood, Dad called as the afternoon started fading. Nothing too big, just enough to get us through dinner and maybe some ghost stories. I rolled my eyes but walked into the trees, glad for something to do. The forest around our campsite wasn't dense, mostly pine with some oak and sweet gum trees scattered throughout. Fallen branches littered the ground, making my job easy. I gathered an armful and was about to head back when I spotted the path. It wasn't much, just a narrow trail winding between the trees, but it clearly led toward the canal. Curiosity got the better of me. I dropped the wood in a pile, figuring I'd come back for it, and followed the path. The farther I went, the quieter the forest became. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, just the soft crunch of pine needles under my sneakers. After about 5 minutes of walking, I reached the canal. It wasn't much to look at, maybe 15 feet across, the water dark and still. Cypress knees poked up along the banks like gnarly fingers. Something rustled in the underbrush on the opposite side, probably a raccoon or possum. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. I was about to turn back when I heard it, footsteps behind me. My first thought was that Emma or Caleb had followed me, trying to scare me like they always did. The footsteps were light, almost careful, padding softly on the forest floor. I smiled to myself, thinking I'd turn the tables on whichever one of them it was. I waited until the steps got closer, then spun around fast, arms raised, ready to yell, "Boo!" The scream died in my throat. It wasn't Emma. It wasn't Caleb. It wasn't human. 10 feet away stood something straight out of a nightmare. It stood maybe 4 feet tall with a stocky, powerful build. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur that hung in clumps from muscular arms. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice. Flat and wide, with a pushed-in nose and a mouth too big for its head, filled with yellow teeth that looked sharp as razors. Its eyes were the worst part, small, glittering and fixed right on me, with an intelligence that didn't belong in an animal. For 3 heartbeats we just stared at each other. Then its mouth opened wide, wider than any mouth should open, and it made a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It wasn't a growl or a screech. It was a sound like hell itself had opened up. A high-pitched wailing that dropped suddenly into a guttural roar. The sound bounced off the trees and echoed across the water, making my ears ring and my stomach turn. "Hello?" I managed to stammer, backing up slowly. My heel hit a root and I stumbled. That's when it moved. The thing dropped to a crouch and charged, covering the distance between us in seconds. I tried to run, but it was too fast. It slammed into my chest, knocking me flat on my back. The impact drove the air from my lungs. Before I could catch my breath, it was on top of me, its weight pressing down on my chest, its breath hot and rotten against my face. I screamed then, a real scream, as loud as my lungs would allow. The creature's head darted forward, jaws snapping. I threw my arm up instinctively, and its teeth grazed my forearm, tearing my sleeve. Pain shot through my arm, but adrenaline kept me fighting. I bucked and thrashed, trying to throw it off, but it was incredibly strong for its size. It made that awful sound again right in my face, and then lunged for my neck. I felt teeth scrape against my skin, not quite breaking through, but leaving burning lines of pain. I screamed again, this time calling for my parents. "Dad! Mom! Help me!" The creature paused at my shouts, its head tilting slightly as if listening. From the direction of our campsite, I heard my father's voice call back. "Jason? Where are you, son?" The thing on my chest froze. Its nostrils flared, sniffing the air. It slowly raised itself up, still straddling me but no longer trying to bite. I laid there, paralyzed with fear, afraid that any movement might trigger another attack. More voices joined my father's, Mom calling my name, Emma and Caleb sounding scared. The creature's head swiveled toward the sounds, then back to me. Up close, I could see details I wished I couldn't. The way its skin pulled tight across its face, the crusty matter in the corners of its eyes, the pieces of what looked like meat stuck between its teeth. It sniffed again, longer this time, then did something that haunts me to this day. It stood up on 2 legs, perfectly balanced, perfectly upright, and stared down at me. There was nothing animal-like in the way it stood. It was as human a posture as you'd see on any street in America, except nothing about this thing was human. Without taking its eyes off me, it backed away slowly, step by careful step, until it reached the edge of the canal. Then, still watching me, it turned and waded into the water. It didn't splash or thrash, it moved smoothly, purposefully, swimming with strong strokes to the opposite bank. Water streamed from its fur as it climbed out, and without a backward glance, it disappeared into the trees on the other side. I laid there for maybe 30 seconds, frozen in shock. Then the pain in my neck and arm registered, and I scrambled to my feet. My legs shook so badly I nearly fell again. I heard my family getting closer, calling my name. "Here!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "I'm here! By the canal!" I stumbled back toward the path, desperate to reach them. I'd gone maybe 20 feet when Dad burst through the trees, Mom right behind him. One look at my face told them something was wrong. "Jason, what happened?" Dad grabbed my shoulders. "You're white as a sheet." I couldn't speak. My throat closed up and tears spilled down my cheeks. I pointed toward the canal, trying to form words. "You're bleeding," Mom said, her voice rising in panic as she spotted the marks on my neck. "Jim, he's bleeding!" Dad's face hardened. "Did someone hurt you, son? Was there someone else out here?" I shook my head, then nodded, then shook it again. Not someone. Something. Emma and Caleb caught up then, their eyes wide with fear. "Let's get back to camp," Dad said firmly. "Jason needs to sit down." Dad half carried me back to the campsite. Mum cleaned the scratches on my neck and the deeper cut on my arm while I told them what happened, my words tumbling out between sobs and gasps for air. I could tell from their faces they didn't believe me. Not really. Dad exchanged looks with Mom, the kind adults share when they think a kid is exaggerating. "It was probably a bear cub," Dad suggested, applying antiseptic that stung worse than the actual wounds. "You startled it, and it got defensive." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "It had a face, it had hands. It stood up and walked like a person." "Could have been a chimpanzee," Mom offered. "Maybe it escaped from somewhere." "In Charlton County, Georgia?" Dad scoffed. "Who around here owns a chimp?" They went back and forth like that while I sat trembling, the image of the thing's face burning in my mind. Emma and Caleb stayed unusually quiet, huddled together on the other side of the campfire Dad had hurriedly built. "Well, whatever it was, it's gone now," Dad finally concluded. "Those scratches aren't deep. You'll be fine, son." But I wasn't fine, not even close. We ate dinner in silence. Mom had made beef stew in the Dutch oven, but I couldn't stomach more than a few bites. Every sound from the surrounding forest made me flinch, a branch snapping, an owl hooting, the wind rustling leaves. My mind kept replaying those moments by the canal, the weight of the creature on my chest, the smell of its breath, that ungodly sound it made. After dinner, Dad suggested we all sleep in the big family tent, instead of splitting up like we'd planned. Nobody argued. As darkness fell completely, we zipped ourselves in, a wall of nylon our only protection from whatever lurked in the woods. I laid awake for hours, listening. Sometimes I thought I heard splashing from the direction of the canal. Other times, I swore something was moving around our campsite, circling the tent. Dad claimed it was raccoons when I shook him awake the third time. "Go to sleep, Jason," he muttered. "Nothing's going to get you in here." But all I could think about was how easily those teeth would tear through the tent walls. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first grey light filtered through the tent fabric, I was already sitting up, red-eyed and exhausted. The scratches on my neck had scabbed over during the night, itching something fierce. The cut on my arm looked worse, puffy and red around the edges. Mum took one look at my arm and decided camping was over. "That needs proper cleaning," she declared. "We're going home today." Dad started to argue, but stopped when he saw my face. "All right," he conceded. "We'll pack up after breakfast." As they broke down the campsite, I stayed close, jumping at every sound. Twice I thought I saw movement in the trees, but nothing emerged. Emma and Caleb kept asking me questions about the monster until Mom told them to stop pestering me. The drive home passed in a blur. My arm throbbed, and fever set in by afternoon. Mom took me straight to Dr. Harding's office when we got back to town. He cleaned the wound properly, gave me a tetanus shot, and prescribed antibiotics for the infection. "What kind of animal did this?" he asked, examining the bite through his thick glasses. "I don't know," I answered truthfully. He looked at me strangely, but didn't press further. That night, the nightmares started. In them, I was always back by that canal, but this time there were dozens of the creatures surrounding me, their mouths open in those impossible grins. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced one was in my bedroom. School started in September, and rumors about my encounter had somehow spread. Some kids called me crazy. Others made up their own versions of what happened. A few seemed genuinely interested, especially Billy Watson, whose grandfather worked as a ranger in the Okefenokee. My grandpa says there's been stories about dwarf creatures in those swamps since before white folks settled here, Billy told me one day at lunch. Creek Indians called them little devils and stayed clear of certain parts of the swamp because of them. I didn't know whether to feel validated or more frightened. Weeks passed. The physical wounds healed, but I couldn't shake the fear. I refused to go anywhere near the woods. When Dad mentioned camping again the following summer, I locked myself in my room and wouldn't come out for hours. In October, something happened that made everything worse. A local newspaper ran a small story about a fisherman who'd gone missing near the same canal where I'd had my encounter. They found his boat 3 days later, empty except for a tackle box and a blood-stained life jacket. His body never turned up. I cut out the article and kept it in my desk drawer. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that something was out there. I started collecting similar stories, missing hikers, unexplained animal attacks, strange sightings in remote areas of the county. There weren't many, but each one I found sent shivers down my spine. By Christmas, Mom was worried enough about my obsession to take me to a child psychologist in Jacksonville. Dr. Merrill listened to my story without interrupting, his expression neutral. "What you experienced was certainly traumatic, Jason," he said when I finished. "Whether it was exactly as you remember or whether fear altered your perception doesn't really matter. What matters is helping you move past it." I didn't bother telling him about my collection of newspaper clippings or the research I'd started doing at the library on cryptids and unknown primates. He'd just think I was feeding my delusions. The therapy sessions continued through spring. I got better at pretending I was over it, that I no longer believed in the creature by the canal. My nightmares became less frequent. I could go outside without constantly looking over my shoulder. Everyone thought I was improving, but I knew the truth. Whatever I saw that day was real. It was out there, in the backwoods and waterways of Charlton County, along with others of its kind. Maybe they'd been there for centuries, hiding, watching, occasionally revealing themselves to unlucky people like me. I never went camping again, never went fishing in remote spots or hiking in the deep woods. Even now, all these years later, the sound of water lapping against a shore makes my heart race. The smell of pine trees and stagnant water brings it all rushing back, the weight on my chest, the rotting breath, those intelligent eyes sizing me up like prey. Sometimes I wonder if it recognized me as a child, if that's why it stopped its attack when it heard my parents' voices. I wonder if it was simply curious or hungry or defending its territory. I wonder how many other people have seen these creatures and stayed silent, afraid of being called crazy or attention seekers. I don't have answers, just scars, memories, and a certainty that there are things in this world we aren't meant to understand, things that hide in dark waters and watch us from the shadows of the forest, waiting for someone to wander too far from safety. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it's still out there, remembering me too. Story 9. The moon hung fat and bright over the Georgia pines as I guided Shadow along the familiar dirt trail. My watch read 8:43 p.m., later than I'd planned to be out, but I needed the training hours. The regional cross-country endurance race was just 6 weeks away, and Shadow and I were determined to place this year. "Easy, boy," I murmured, patting the Arabian's glossy black neck as we crossed the wooden bridge spanning Sweetwater Creek. The boards creaked under Shadow's hooves, the sound carrying through the still evening air. I'd been working at Hartwell Ranch since I was 14, and these woods felt as familiar as my own backyard. 4 years of riding these trails had given me a confidence that most folks would call foolish for night riding. But the moonlight was bright enough to turn the wide dirt road silver. Shadow's ears flicked back and forth as we approached the S-curve that wound around a particularly dense patch of woods. The temperature had dropped noticeably in the last few minutes, and I could see my breath fogging in the chill air, strange for June, even as night fell. "Just a few more miles, then we'll head back," I promised Shadow, adjusting my position in the saddle. Shadow snorted suddenly, his muscles tensing beneath me. He slowed his pace, then stopped completely. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, scanning the trail ahead. Nothing seemed out of place. The pale dirt path curved gently between dark walls of trees, moonlight spilling across it like water. Shadow pawed the ground nervously, tossing his head. I'd never seen him act like this. He was always steady, even during thunderstorms that sent other horses into a panic. My stomach tightened with a sudden, inexplicable dread. I was about to turn around when I heard it, rustling from the woods to our right, like something large moving through the underbrush. Shadow's ears pinned back against his head. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the vast darkness. "Anybody there?" The rustling stopped. For 3 heartbeats, everything was silent. Then a scream tore through the night, a sound so raw and chilling that my blood froze in my veins. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in these woods or anywhere on this earth. Shadow reared slightly, and I gripped the reins tighter. In the darkness between the trees, I caught a glimpse of 2 greenish eyes, glowing like phosphorus, hovering about 7 feet off the ground. "Oh, Jesus," I whispered. Everything happened so fast after that. A massive shape exploded from the trees, moving with terrifying speed. In the moonlight I saw it leap, a blur of dark mass, hurtling straight toward us. Shadow screamed, a high, terrified sound I'd never heard from him before. The creature slammed into us from the side, its weight making the saddle shift dramatically. I felt massive hands, yes, hands, gripping the back of my saddle, claws digging into the leather. Pure instinct took over. I released the reins and threw myself forward, wrapping my arms around Shadow's neck and pressing my face against his mane. The horse needed no urging. He bolted, his powerful legs driving us forward with desperate speed. For one terrible moment, I found myself face to face with the thing attacking us. In the moonlight, I could see it clearly, and God help me, it looked almost human. But wrong. All wrong. Its face was broader, more bestial, with wiry hair covering its cheeks and neck. Its nose was flatter, nostrils flaring wide as it snarled. But it was the eyes that haunted me most. Intelligent, calculating, and filled with a hunger that turned my insides to water. Yellowed teeth snapped inches from my leg, several gaps visible where teeth should have been. Its breath hit me, the rancid stench of rotting meat and something else, something chemical and sharp. Shadow's sudden burst of speed saved us both. The creature's grip on the saddle slipped, and I heard leather tearing as its claws raked deep gouges through the material. It fell away with a frustrated howl that echoed through the trees. Shadow ran like he'd never run before, his powerful body stretching and contracting beneath me as we fled down the trail. I didn't try to control him. His panic was carrying us away from that thing, and that was all that mattered. I kept my body low, clinging to his neck, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I don't know how long we ran. Minutes stretched like hours as Shadow tore down the moonlit trails, veering off our usual path and crashing through less traveled routes. Eventually, his pace slowed from a dead gallop to a canter, then a trot, his sides heaving with exertion, foam flecking his neck. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice shaking uncontrollably. "You saved us, boy. You saved us." I didn't dare stop or turn back toward the ranch. Whatever that thing was, it might still be out there following us. I guided Shadow toward the county road, hoping to find help, or at least the safety of open space and possible traffic. But the road, when we reached it, was deserted. With no better option, I directed Shadow along the shoulder, heading east toward the Jacksons' farm. No relation to me, despite the shared surname. They were good people who might give us shelter for the night. Shadow walked with his head low, exhausted from our flight, while I kept scanning the darkness behind us, jumping at every rustle of leaves or snap of twigs. We reached the Jackson farm just after midnight. Earl Jackson answered my frantic knocking with a shotgun in hand, but quickly lowered it when he recognized me. "Tyler? What in God's name are you doing here this time of night?" I must have looked a mess, wild-eyed, covered in dirt and sweat, trembling like I had the flu. "Something attacked us in the woods," I managed to say, my teeth chattering despite the mild night. "Something big. Not a bear. Not anything I've ever seen." Earl ushered me inside while his son took Shadow to their barn. Once I had a cup of hot coffee in my hands, I told them what happened. I could see the disbelief in their faces, though they were kind enough not to say it outright. "Probably a mountain lion," Earl suggested. "They can look mighty strange in the moonlight, especially when you're not expecting one." I knew it wasn't a mountain lion. Mountain lions don't have hands. They don't have almost human faces. But I nodded anyway, too tired to argue. I spent the night on their couch, though I didn't sleep a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing green ones staring back at me, felt that hot breath on my skin. When morning finally came, I thanked the Jacksons for their hospitality and headed back to Hartwell Ranch with Shadow. The ride back was tense. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move. Every bird call made me flinch, but we stuck to the open road and nothing troubled us in the bright morning light. When I arrived at the ranch, Mr. Hartwell was waiting in the yard. His usual friendly expression was replaced by something hard and closed. He watched silently as I dismounted and led Shadow toward the stable. "You're late," he said finally, his voice flat. "Expected you back last night." "Something happened," I began, ready to tell him about the creature, show him the damaged saddle as proof. "In the woods." "Shadow needs to be checked out," he interrupted. "He looks exhausted. Take him to the stable, remove his tack, and wait for me there." I nodded, leading the tired horse to his stall. As I removed the saddle, I examined the deep gouges in the leather. 4 parallel lines where the creature's claws had dug in. The damage was severe. The expensive endurance saddle was nearly torn through in places. Mr. Hartwell entered the stable as I was brushing Shadow down. He said nothing as he examined the horse, running his hands over Shadow's legs and flanks, checking for injuries. "What happened to the saddle?" I asked, pointing to where I'd placed it on the rack. "Something attacked us in the woods last night. It came right at us from the trees. You can see where its claws." "What saddle?" Mr. Hartwell interrupted, his voice eerily calm. I turned to point at the damaged saddle, but it was gone. The rack where I'd placed it just minutes earlier was empty. "I just put it there," I said, confusion making my voice rise. "It was torn up pretty bad. There was this thing in the woods." "Tyler." Mr. Hartwell cut me off again, his expression unreadable. "I think you've been working too hard. Shadow seems fine, just tired. He's being sent to the Wilkins farm tomorrow for their breeding program. We've been planning it for months." I stared at him. "What? No one told me anything about that." "No reason you needed to know," he replied coolly. "And speaking of knowing things, I think it's time we discussed your employment here." A cold feeling spread through my stomach. "What about it?" "It's terminated. Effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You're firing me? Why? Because of last night?" "Mr. Hartwell, I swear something attacked us." "This has nothing to do with whatever stories you're telling," he said sharply. "The ranch is downsizing. I can't afford to keep you on. I'll pay you through the end of the month, but I want you off the property by noon." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. 4 years of loyal work, and he was throwing me out with no warning, no real explanation. And the saddle, where had it gone? The only evidence of what happened last night had simply vanished. "Can I at least say goodbye to Shadow?" I asked, my voice cracking. Mr. Hartwell's face softened slightly. "Make it quick," he said, then turned and left the stable. I spent my last few minutes at Hartwell Ranch with my arms around Shadow's neck, my face pressed against his warm hide. "I don't know what's going on," I whispered to him, "but I'm going to find out." I left the ranch with my final paycheck and a cardboard box containing my few belongings from the tack room. As I walked down the long driveway, I glanced back at the main house. Mr. Hartwell stood at the window watching me. Our eyes met briefly before he stepped back, letting the curtain fall. Over the next week, I tried everything to make sense of what had happened. I went to the sheriff's office to report the attack, but Deputy Simmons just took notes with a bored expression and suggested I'd seen a bear or a wild dog. When I mentioned the glowing eyes and human-like features, he stopped writing altogether and gave me a look that said he thought I was either crazy or lying. I drove by the ranch several times, hoping to catch one of the other hands alone to ask questions, but they avoided me like I had the plague. The one time I managed to corner Billy Winters at the gas station, he just shook his head and said, "Let it go, Tyler. Some things around here you don't ask about." 2 weeks after that night in the woods, I ran into Jenny Hartwell, the owner's daughter, at the Piggly Wiggly. She'd always been friendly to me, and I hoped she might have some answers. "Jenny," I called, hurrying over to her in the produce section. "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" She glanced around nervously. "Tyler, I can't be seen talking to you. Dad would kill me. I just need to know what happened," I pleaded. "Why'd he fire me like that? And what happened to Shadow's saddle?" Jenny bit her lip, indecision clear on her face. Finally, she sighed. "Look, this isn't the first time something like this has happened, okay? There's a reason we don't let anyone ride those trails after dark." My heart raced. "So you know about the creature?" "I don't know anything," she said quickly. "Just that every few years someone sees something they shouldn't and then they have to go. Dad says it's part of the arrangement." "What arrangement?" I pressed. "Jenny, please." She glanced over my shoulder, then leaned closer. "The woods don't belong to us, Tyler. Not really. The ranch has been in our family for generations, but we're more like caretakers. There's an understanding." "An understanding with what?" I asked, my mouth dry. "I don't know," she whispered. "No one talks about it directly. But whatever's out there, we leave it alone, and it mostly leaves us alone. Except sometimes—" She trailed off, her eyes troubled. "Sometimes what?" "Sometimes it gets hungry," she said simply. And we looked the other way. A chill ran down my spine. "Your dad, he's covering for that thing. It tried to kill me." "Keep your voice down," she hissed. "It's not that simple. The arrangement protects the whole county. If it's not appeased—" She shook her head. "Just drop it, Tyler. Move on. Maybe even move away." Before I could ask anything else, she hurried away, leaving me standing alone among the tomatoes and lettuce. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jenny's words kept repeating in my mind. "Sometimes it gets hungry." What did that mean? Was the Hartwell Ranch some kind of feeding ground for the creature? Were they sacrificing animals to it, or worse? I thought about Shadow, supposedly sent away for breeding. I thought about the missing saddle. I thought about how quickly Mr. Hartwell had fired me, how the other ranch hands avoided me now. They were hiding something, all of them, and whatever it was, it had to do with that thing in the woods. The next morning I made a decision. I wasn't going to run away. Douglas County was my home. If something was preying on people here, something the authorities were willfully ignoring, then someone needed to expose it. I would go back to those woods. Not at night. I wasn't that stupid. But in daylight I could look for evidence. Tracks, hair, anything that might prove what I'd seen was real. And maybe, just maybe, I could find out what kind of arrangement the Hartwells had with the creature that had nearly killed me. What I didn't realize then was how deep the secret went, or how many people in Douglas County were part of keeping it. I didn't know that by asking questions I was making myself a target, not just for the thing in the woods, but for those who protected it. And I certainly didn't know that this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change my life forever. Story 10. My breath fogged in the crisp November air as I crouched to examine the blood spatter on the fallen leaves. Fresh, dark crimson against the brown forest floor. The buck was hurt bad. My shot had connected, but not clean enough for a quick kill. I'd been tracking it for nearly an hour now, following the erratic trail up the eastern slope of Pigeon Mountain. The light was fading fast. I checked my watch. 4:47 p.m., maybe 40 minutes of usable daylight left. Just enough time to find the wounded animal and field dress it before dark if I hurried. I wiped sweat from my forehead, despite the cold. 22 years I'd been hunting these Georgia woods, since I was 12 years old, plus 3 tours in Vietnam. Nothing much rattled me anymore. I'd taken dozens of deer from these mountains, knew every ridge and hollow, like the lines on my palm. The blood trail led me along a well-worn game path that cut across the mountain face. The drops were getting bigger, closer together. The buck was weakening. I tightened my grip on my Remington 700, picked up my pace. That's when I felt it. A prickling sensation at the back of my neck. The hair on my arms stood up beneath my flannel shirt. I stopped dead in my tracks, suddenly aware of the complete silence around me. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees, nothing. I'd been so focused on the blood trail that I hadn't noticed the forest going quiet. In these woods, silence wasn't natural. There should have been squirrels chattering, jays calling, leaves rustling. The absence of sound hit me like a physical blow. Something was watching me. I slowly turned, scanning the trees behind me. The shadows between the trunks seemed to deepen as the sun sank lower. Nothing moved. I took a deep breath, tried to shake off the feeling, just my imagination getting the better of me. I turned back to the trail. Crack. The sound of a breaking branch echoed from somewhere to my right, down the slope. I froze, rifle halfway to my shoulder. Rustle, snap. Something was moving parallel to me, just out of sight down the mountainside. Something big enough to break substantial branches. Bear, I thought immediately. Black bears were common enough in Walker County, but bears made steady noise when they moved, continuous crashing through underbrush. This was different. Crack, silence, rustle, silence. The pattern was deliberate. Move, stop, like it was pacing itself against me. I started walking again, faster now, no longer concerned with the wounded deer. The sounds kept pace with me. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. The sound died in the thick air. No echo, no response. I worked the bolt on my rifle, chambering a fresh round even though one was already loaded. The metallic click was reassuring in the unnatural quiet. The light was draining from the sky now, the trees becoming black silhouettes against deep blue. I needed to get down the mountain. I picked up my pace to a fast walk, nearly a jog. The sounds matched me. Faster now, heavier footfalls, not a bear. Bears don't stalk like that. Cougars move silent as ghosts. This was something else. I stopped abruptly, listening hard, complete silence. But the feeling of being watched intensified. I knew it was still there, tracking me, even though I couldn't hear it. I'd hunted these mountains my entire life. Knew every animal, every sound, every movement pattern. This wasn't right. This wasn't anything I recognized. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sweat ran down my back despite the November chill. I quickened my pace again, no longer even pretending to track the wounded buck. I just wanted down, wanted out. The parallel movement resumed. keeping perfect time with me. 20 yards away, 30, hard to tell in the growing darkness and dense trees. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, part grunt, part growl. Not a bear, not a cougar, not a wild boar or coyote. Nothing I'd ever heard in these woods or any woods. I broke into a run. Branches whipped my face. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely keeping my footing on the steep slope. The crashing kept pace with me, no longer trying to be stealthy. Whatever it was running too. The ground leveled out as I neared the base of the mountain. My truck was parked at the old logging road about a quarter-mile west. I veered in that direction, gasping for breath. I realized my mistake within 50 yards. The old game trail I'd turned onto dead-ended at a massive briar patch. A wall of thorns and tangled vines stretching 30 feet high and at least that wide. I'd hit a dead end. The crashing sounds behind me slowed. Deliberate footsteps now, heavy, approaching. Another grunt, closer, a sound like heavy breathing. I spun around, rifle raised, peering into the darkness. The trees had become black columns against a navy blue sky. I could barely make out shapes beyond 20 feet. "Stay back!" I shouted, voice trembling despite myself. "I'm armed!" No response, but more footsteps. Closer. A branch snapped 10 yards behind me. I fired a warning shot into the air. The blast was deafening in the silent forest. For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. Then the footsteps resumed even closer. Pure panic took over. I turned to the briar patch, the only direction my pursuer wasn't blocking. Without thinking, I threw myself into it. Thorns tore at my clothes, ripped into my skin. I pushed forward, hands bleeding, face scratched, the thorns catching and pulling at my jacket, my pants, my hair. I didn't care. I crashed through the briars like a wounded animal, desperate, terrified. On the other side, I stumbled out onto the logging road just 50 yards from my truck. I ran flat out, rifle clutched in bloody hands, lungs burning. Behind me, I heard movement in the briars, something forcing its way through, following my path. I reached the truck, fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slammed and locked the door, then frantically started the engine. As the headlights came on, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of their beam, something large withdrawing into the darkness beyond the briars. Then that sound again. The grunt growl, closer and clearer than before. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out, tires spinning on the dirt road before catching. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement 10 minutes later. That was 14 years ago, November 8th, 1974. I haven't been back to Pigeon Mountain since, not for hunting, not for anything. I told Bill Carver, the game warden, about it the next day. He looked at me like I was crazy, especially when he saw the torn-up state of me, cuts all over my face and hands, jacket shredded. "Probably just a bear, Ethan," he said, not unkindly. "They can act funny sometimes, especially if you got between a mama and cubs." But it wasn't a bear. I know bears. This was something else. Over the years, I've heard other stories. Hunters reporting strange experiences in the deeper parts of the county forests. Hikers feeling watched. The Arnett's boy claimed something chased him all the way back to their property line when he was squirrel hunting in '81. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods, but never alone and never on Pigeon Mountain. I'm 62 now, retired from the lumber mill for 3 years. Plenty of time to think about what happened that day. Sometimes I tell myself it was just fear playing tricks on me. A man alone in the woods at dusk, imagination running wild. Then I remember the deliberate way it moved. The calculated stalking, the way it matched my pace exactly, the way it waited when I waited, moved when I moved. No animal does that. No animal thinks that way. Whatever was on Pigeon Mountain that November evening wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent. It was hunting me. Last spring, my grandson Connor started asking me to take him hunting. He's 12 now, same age I was when my daddy first took me out. I've been putting him off with excuses about waiting till he's older. Truth is, I don't trust the woods anymore. Not like I used to. Every time I step under those trees, I feel eyes on me. Every unexplained sound sends my heart racing. Every shadow holds a potential threat. Connor doesn't understand. How could he? I've never told him the full story, never told anyone except Bill Carver, and he didn't believe me. Last week, Connor showed me a website on his phone, something about Bigfoot sightings in North Georgia. Kids these days with their internet. He scrolled through grainy photos, excited about the possibility of monsters in our backyard. I didn't have the heart to tell him that there are things in these woods that are worse than the made-up creatures from campfire stories. Things that think, things that hunt, things that wait. Because that's what haunts me most about that day. Not just the terror of being stalked, but the calculated nature of it, the intelligence behind it. The fact that it herded me into that briar patch, cut off my escape routes, moved with purpose and planning. What haunts me is knowing it's still out there, walking those same ridges and hollows, watching from the shadows between the trees, waiting. Sometimes at night, when the wind moves through the pines behind my house, I imagine I hear that sound again, that grunt growl from the darkness. I lie awake, wondering if it's found me after all these years. Wondering if one night I'll look out my bedroom window and see eyes staring back at me from the tree line. I've got my Remington mounted above the fireplace, loaded. I keep a flashlight by my bed, lock the doors and windows even in summer. Connor's going hunting with his other grandfather next weekend, down in the flatlands near Dalton, not up in the mountains. Still, I've been having nightmares. In them, I'm back on that mountain. But it's Connor being chased, Connor trapped against the briars. I wake up sweating, heart pounding. I should warn him. Tell him to be careful. Tell him there are things in the deep woods that don't have names. But what 12-year-old boy believes in monsters? What 12-year-old boy would understand that sometimes the most dangerous things in this world aren't the ones we make up, but the ones we can't explain? So I keep my fears to myself. Keep my shotgun loaded, keep my doors locked at night, and I never, ever go back to Pigeon Mountain, because whatever was hunting me that day is still there, still waiting, and next time I might not make it to my truck. Here's your tune. Story 11. I was up before dawn that July morning in '78. Nothing unusual about that. Had been doing it for nearly 3 decades by then, rising when most folks were still deep in their dreams. The woods called to me in those quiet hours, when the night creatures were settling down and the day animals hadn't yet stirred. That perfect in-between time when the forest feels like it belongs to no one but you. My name's Taylor Falls, born and raised in Cleveland County, North Carolina, and been hunting these woods since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Vietnam vet. Worked at the paper mill in Shelby when I wasn't hunting. Not that any of that matters much anymore. I parked my old Ford pickup at the end of the logging road and grabbed my Remington 30-06. It was my daddy's rifle, before it was mine. The walnut stock was worn smooth from years of handling, and I could work the bolt action in my sleep. I'd taken my first buck with that rifle when I was 13, and in the years since, we'd developed the kind of relationship that only forms between a hunter and his trusted weapon. The air was thick that morning, heavy with humidity that clung to my skin as I made my way through the underbrush. It was only around 5:30, but I could already tell it was going to be a scorcher. Classic North Carolina summer. The cicadas were starting their daily chorus, and somewhere off in the distance, a whippoorwill called out its name. I moved through the forest with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing every inch of your hunting grounds. These weren't just any woods to me. They were my second home. I knew where the deer bedded down, where they watered, and which trails they followed. I headed toward a small clearing about 2 miles in. It was a good spot, a natural bottleneck where the deer would pass through on their way to the creek. I'd taken a decent 8-pointer there the previous season. As I neared the clearing, I slowed my pace, careful to place each foot silently. The first hints of daylight were filtering through the canopy, creating patches of grey-blue light on the forest floor. The woods were waking up, but still quiet enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. I found a good position at the edge of the clearing, my back against a large oak tree, and settled in to wait. I didn't bother with a tree stand that morning. Sometimes I preferred being at ground level, more a part of the forest than above it. Time passed slow and easy, the way it always does when you're hunting. I stayed perfectly still, tuned into every sound and movement around me. A blue jay complained loudly from a nearby branch. A squirrel scampered across the forest floor, unconcerned with my presence. The woods were alive with the kind of ordinary activity that tells you everything is as it should be. And then, about 20 minutes after I'd settled in, I caught movement at the far edge of the clearing. My breath caught in my throat as I saw him, a magnificent buck stepping cautiously from the shadows. Even from a distance I could tell he was special. 10 points at least, possibly 12, with a spread wider than anything I'd seen in years. He moved with that regal caution that old bucks develop, stopping every few steps to test the air. The rising sun caught his antlers, giving them an almost golden glow against the dark trees behind him. He was about 80 yards away, an easy shot with my rifle. I raised the Remington slowly, pressing the cool stock against my cheek. Through the scope, I could see him clearly now. Definitely a 12-pointer, with thick, muscular shoulders and a chest that spoke of a deer that had survived many seasons. A trophy by anyone's standards. I drew a slow breath, preparing for the shot. My finger tensed against the trigger, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack. The buck lowered his head to nibble at something on the ground, presenting a perfect broadside shot. And that's when everything changed. Something, some instinct honed by decades in the woods and a tour in Vietnam, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Before I could process what was happening, a dark shape burst from the underbrush to my right, moving with a speed that didn't seem possible for something so large. It tore across the clearing between me and the buck, running upright on 2 legs. The deer bolted instantly, white tail flashing as it disappeared back into the trees. But I barely noticed, because my entire attention was fixed on what had just entered my world. It stood there perfectly still now, about 40 yards away. 6.5 feet tall, if it was an inch, covered in thick jet-black hair or fur. Not the brown of a bear or the tawny color of a mountain lion. This was midnight black, absorbing what little sunlight touched it, and its face. God, its face wasn't right. It was flat, almost human-like, but not human at all. Not a bear's snout or any animal I'd ever encountered in 30 years of hunting these woods. Its eyes were set forward, predator's eyes, and they were looking directly at me. I realized I was still holding my rifle up, aimed now at this thing instead of where the buck had been. My hands were steady, combat training kicking in, but my mind was reeling. What the hell was I looking at? For several seconds that stretched into an eternity, we just stared at each other, me and this creature. There was recognition in those eyes, intelligence. It knew exactly what I was, what the rifle meant, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. It must have weighed at least 300 pounds, all muscle from what I could tell. Its arms hung longer than a man's would, ending in hands, not paws, with what looked like opposable thumbs. Its legs were powerful, built for running upright. Then it made a sound, a low, rumbling growl that wasn't quite a growl at all. It had elements of something almost like speech, but distorted and deep, vibrating in my chest even from that distance. My finger was still on the trigger. I could have pulled it. Maybe I should have. But something stopped me. Some primitive part of my brain screaming that this was wrong, that I didn't want this thing's attention any more than it already had. The standoff lasted maybe 5 seconds total, though it felt like hours. Then, with a sudden burst of movement that startled me into almost pulling the trigger, it turned and bounded back into the thick underbrush. The forest seemed to swallow it whole, leaving no trace except for the crashing sounds of its retreat, which faded with unnatural quickness. I stayed frozen in position for I don't know how long. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I could feel cold sweat running down my back despite the July heat. When I finally lowered my rifle, my arms were shaking so bad I nearly dropped it. I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. A bear? No way. I'd encountered black bears plenty of times over the years. This wasn't a bear. Mountain lion? Absolutely not. Wrong color, wrong build, and mountain lions don't run around on two legs. Some kind of escaped zoo animal. A man in a costume. Each explanation I came up with was more ridiculous than the last. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The woods that had felt so familiar just minutes ago now seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow might be hiding another one of those things. Every sound could be it circling back. I'm not ashamed to admit I left that clearing in a hurry, my hunter's stealth forgotten as I crash-stomped my way back toward the logging road where I'd left my truck. I kept the rifle ready, safety off, turning at every sound. It took me half the time to get back to my truck as it had taken me to reach the clearing. I threw the rifle onto the passenger seat, cranked the engine, and got the hell out of there, the tires spitting gravel as I floored it down the logging road. By the time I reached town, I'd convinced myself I needed to report what I'd seen. Not because I expected anyone to believe me, but because if there was something dangerous in those woods, people needed to know. The sheriff's office in Shelby was quiet that morning. Deputy Jim Bridges was behind the desk when I walked in, still shaking and probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. "Taylor?" he asked, standing up. "You all right? You look like hell, man." I knew Jim since high school. He'd never been a hunter himself, more interested in cars and girls than the woods. But he was a good man. "Need to report something, Jim," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down before you fall down. What happened? Someone poaching on your spot?" I sat heavily and tried to organize my thoughts. How do you tell someone you've seen something impossible? "Saw something in the woods this morning," I started. "Out past Ellis Creek in that clearing near the old Harper property." Jim nodded, pulling out a report form. "What did you see? Trespassers?" "I wish." I took a deep breath. "Saw something I can't explain, Jim. Something that shouldn't be in those woods, shouldn't be anywhere." I described what I'd seen as precisely as I could. The size, the color, the way it moved, that flat, almost human face. Jim's expression changed as I talked, moving from concerned to confused to something close to amused. "You sure you didn't have a little something in your coffee this morning, Taylor?" he asked when I finished, not unkindly. "I know how it sounds," I said, "but I know what I saw. This wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, wasn't anything I can put a name to." Jim sighed and put his pen down. "Look, Taylor, I've known you a long time. You're not the type to make up stories or get spooked by shadows. But what you're describing, I don't know what to do with that information. File it under what? Monster sighting. File it however you want," I said, standing up. "But I'm telling you, there's something in those woods people need to know about." As I turned to leave, I stopped and looked back at him. I don't want a deer bad enough to face that thing ever again. Word got around fast, as it always does in small towns. By that evening, half of Cleveland County had heard some version of my story. Most people figured I'd seen a bear in bad light, or had some kind of hallucination. A few believed me outright, mostly the old-timers who had their own stories about strange things in the deep woods. But then Elmer Jenkins, who owned a gas station down near the county line, mentioned that folks in the southern part of the county had been talking about something similar for years. They even had a name for it, Nobby, after the Knob Creek area where most of the sightings had been. Over the next few weeks, I heard from 3 other people who claimed to have seen something similar over the years. A truck driver who spotted something crossing Highway 226 late one night. A teenager who saw a large, dark figure watching him from the tree line while he was fishing. An old woman who'd been hearing strange noises around her isolated cabin for decades. I sold my hunting equipment that fall. The rifle, the tree stand, my trail cameras, everything. Bobby Turner at the sporting goods store thought I'd lost my mind. "You've been hunting these woods your whole life, Taylor," he said as he counted out my money. "You gonna let one weird experience scare you off?" I just took the cash and said, "Some things change a man, Bobby. Some things you can't unsee." I never went back into those woods alone. Occasionally I'd join a group fishing trip or take my grandkids on the marked trails at the state park. But always with others, always in daylight, and always with one eye on the shadows. People around here still talk about Nobby sometimes, especially when someone new reports a sighting or when strange noises are heard in the night. The stories have grown and changed over the years, as stories do. Some say it's a Bigfoot. Others think it's some kind of escaped government experiment. A few of the more religious folks think it's something demonic. I don't know what it was I saw that summer morning in 1978. I just know it was real, it was intelligent, and it didn't belong in any natural order of things I understood. And I know that there are things in this world that can't be explained by science or reason, things that exist in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the forests of Cleveland County. I wonder if it remembers me the way I remember it, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd pulled that trigger. But mostly, I'm just grateful I made it out of those woods that day, because whatever Nobby is, it's not something a man armed with just a rifle and his wits should ever have to face alone. Story 12. As the clock on my nightstand read 4:17 a.m. when Rex's barking jolted me awake. Not his usual warning bark for raccoons or possums. This was frantic, high-pitched, desperate. I'd lived 88 years on this same patch of Cleveland County soil, and I knew every sound my animals made. This wasn't normal. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my joints protesting the sudden movement. The wooden floor felt ice-cold against my bare feet as I reached for my robe. Rex's barking intensified, a staccato of panic punctuated by growls. "Hush now," I muttered. Though I knew he couldn't hear me through the walls of the old farmhouse my late husband Elmer had built with his own hands back in '32, my first thought was coyotes. They'd been getting bold lately, taking Tom Wheeler's chickens last month and nearly getting one of Sadie Johnson's lambs the week before. I kept a .30-30 Winchester propped by the back door for such occasions, but first I needed to see what had Rex so worked up. I shuffled to the window facing the north pasture, pulled back the faded gingham curtain, and peered into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to make out shapes in the pasture. About 50 feet from the house stood something dark and hunched. My first thought was that Bessie, my oldest milk cow, had somehow pushed through the gate again. She'd done it twice this year already. "Damn fool cow," I whispered, squinting to get a better look. The shape didn't move like Bessie. It remained still, almost unnaturally so. As I watched, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the thing straightened up, rising to its full height, at least 6 feet tall, maybe more. It stood on 2 legs. My breath caught in my throat. The figure turned slowly, deliberately in my direction. Even from this distance I could see it wasn't human, not with that outline. Broad shoulders tapered to a narrower waist, covered in what looked like dark fur or hair that hung long around its body. But it was the face that made my heart nearly stop. Flat, almost pressed in, with no discernible nose protruding like a person would have. Just a dark, flat face turned directly toward my window. It knew I was watching. Rex's barking reached a fever pitch outside, but he kept his distance from the thing, running back and forth along the edge of the porch, refusing to venture closer. The creature and I remained locked in this strange standoff for what felt like hours. but must have been only minutes. It didn't move, just stood there, watching my house, watching my window, watching me. Then, with a fluid motion that no human could replicate, it turned and moved toward the tree line that separated my property from the dense woods beyond. It didn't run exactly, more like it glided, covering ground quickly and silently until the darkness swallowed it. I remained frozen at the window long after it disappeared, my hands trembling so badly I had to grip the windowsill to steady myself. When I finally managed to move, I went straight to the back door and called for Rex. It took him nearly 10 minutes to respond, and when he finally crept onto the porch, his tail was tucked tight between his legs. I brought him inside that night, something I hadn't done since he was a pup. Sleep was impossible. I sat in Elmer's old rocking chair with the Winchester across my lap until dawn painted the sky pink. Only then did I venture outside to check on my livestock, the rifle never leaving my hands. The cows were agitated, huddled in the far corner of their pen, eyes wide and rolling. The chickens clucked nervously in their coop. Near where the creature had stood, I found a series of depressions in the grass, footprints larger than any humans I'd ever seen, with what looked like 5 toes. The grass around them was flattened in a way that suggested great weight. I told myself it must have been a bear, though we hadn't had one around these parts in decades. A bear standing on its hind legs would explain the height, the fur, maybe even the strange face in the poor light. But deep down, I knew better. Bears don't stand still watching houses. Bears don't move the way that thing moved. I called Sheriff Davis later that morning. He came by around noon, walking the property with me, examining the footprints which had already begun to fade in the December sun. "Probably just a bear, Miss Minnie," he said, tipping back his hat and scratching his grey stubbled chin. "They get confused sometimes, wander down from the mountains, especially if food's scarce up there." I could tell he didn't believe it himself, but neither of us had a better explanation. "You'll call if it comes back?" he asked, climbing into his cruiser. "I'll call," I assured him, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. I spent that day checking and reinforcing gates, making sure the livestock was secure. I brought the chickens' feed inside the coop, rather than leaving it in the metal can by the door. I kept Rex close, though the poor dog jumped at every sound. That night, I went to bed with the Winchester propped against the nightstand instead of by the back door. Sleep came eventually, but it was light and troubled. 3 nights passed without incident. I began to think perhaps Sheriff Davis was right. Maybe it had been a confused bear that had wandered through and moved on. On the 4th night, I was awakened not by Rex's barking, but by a sound that sent ice through my veins. A scream, but not like any human scream I'd ever heard. It started low, almost like a moan, then rose in pitch until it became a wailing howl that echoed across the pasture and bounced back from the surrounding hills. It wasn't an animal sound either, at least not from any animal native to these parts. The closest thing I could compare it to was the time I'd heard a panther at the Winston-Salem Zoo, but this was deeper, more sustained, and carried a quality that was almost mournful. Rex didn't bark this time. He whimpered and crawled under my bed. I grabbed the rifle and went to the window again. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving the pasture in near total darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it out there, watching, waiting. The screaming continued on and off throughout the night, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, as if the thing was circling my property. I didn't sleep again that night, or much the next day. By noon, my phone started ringing. "Minnie, you hear them awful noises last night?" Martha Kincaid from 2 miles down the road asked, her voice shaking. "Lyle wanted to drive over and check on you, but I wouldn't let him out the door, not with whatever's making those sounds." Before I could answer, she continued, Sarah Wilson called this morning, said her boys are refusing to sleep in their own rooms now. They've pushed their beds into her and Jim's room, and the Pattersons. They've gone to stay with their daughter in Shelby until whatever this is moves on. The calls kept coming throughout the day. Everyone within earshot had heard the screams. Everyone was frightened. No one had an explanation. That evening, just as dusk settled over the hills, I spotted it again. Not in the pasture this time, but at the edge of the woods. It stood partially hidden behind a large oak tree, but I could make out its shape. The same tall, broad-shouldered, fur-covered figure. It remained there for nearly an hour, just watching the house. I kept the rifle trained on it through the window, but something held me back from firing. Fear, maybe, or the awareness that if I missed, I might provoke it. As darkness fell completely, it disappeared back into the woods. An hour later, the screaming began again. This pattern continued for days. Sightings at dawn or dusk, blood-curdling screams through the night. Word spread through the county. People started calling it Nobby, after Carpenter Knob, the small rise at the north end of my property. Some local boys, braver or more foolish than most, came with their hunting rifles, hoping to catch a glimpse or even take a shot at the creature. They left disappointed and considerably more frightened after hearing the screams up close. By the end of the second week, I was exhausted from lack of sleep and constant vigilance. I hadn't been able to tend properly to my livestock. Neighbors helped when they could, coming in groups during daylight hours to feed the animals and repair a section of fence that had been damaged. Not broken through, just bent and twisted, as if something large had leaned against it. Sheriff Davis came by regularly, sometimes bringing deputies, but they never managed to be there when the creature appeared. They found more footprints, though, and strange tufts of reddish-brown hair caught on the barbed wire fence at the edge of my property. Davis sent the hair to someone he knew at the state lab in Raleigh, but the results came back inconclusive. Animal hair, species unknown. "Maybe you should stay with your sister in Charlotte for a while," Davis suggested during one visit, "just until we figure out what's going on here." I shook my head firmly. "I've lived on this land for 88 years, Sheriff. I buried my Elmer here. I'm not leaving because of some whatever it is." But the truth was the creature, Nobby as everyone now called it, was changing me. I carried the rifle everywhere, even to collect eggs or feed the cats. I jumped at sounds I'd heard 1,000 times before. I found myself scanning the tree line constantly, expecting to see that dark shape watching me. Sleep became a luxury, snatched in short bursts during daylight hours when neighbors could keep watch. The worst part was the isolation. After dark, no one came to Carpenter Knob anymore. The road past my house, once busy with local traffic heading to and from town, fell silent after sunset. In the evenings, I could look out my window at the scattered lights of neighboring farms and know that behind each glowing square, people were locking doors, loading guns, and praying that Nobby wouldn't turn its attention their way. 23 days after my first sighting, something changed. I was washing dishes after a meager dinner when Rex, who had been curled at my feet, suddenly raised his head and growled. Not his warning bark, but a low, continuous rumble. Before I could react, something hit the back door with enough force to rattle the frame. I grabbed the rifle and moved to the side of the door, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Another thud, harder this time. The door shook in its frame. A third impact, and I heard the wood begin to splinter. Whatever was out there wanted in, and the old door wouldn't hold it for long. With shaking hands, I raised the rifle and aimed at the door, finger resting lightly on the trigger. The next impact left a crack in one of the panels. Through it, I caught a glimpse of something dark and hairy. The stench hit me then, a powerful, musty odor like wet fur, and something else, something wild and foreign. "Get away from my house!" I shouted, my voice stronger than I felt. The assault on the door stopped instantly. For a moment, complete silence fell. Then, from just outside, came a deep, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite speech, but something in between. It rose and fell in a pattern that almost resembled words. I backed away from the door, rifle still raised. Rex pressed himself against my legs, trembling violently. The strange vocalization continued for another minute, then stopped abruptly. Heavy footsteps moved across my back porch, down the steps and away from the house. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I sat with my back against the wall opposite the damaged door, rifle across my knees, until dawn came. In the morning light, I examined the door. 3 of the wooden panels were cracked, and deep gouges marked the frame, not from claws, but from something blunt and powerful hitting the wood repeatedly. On the porch floor, I found more of the reddish-brown hair, and more disturbingly, a clear handprint pressed into the wood of the railing, much larger than a human hand, with 5 distinct fingerprints. That afternoon, Sheriff Davis brought 2 state wildlife officials to my home. They examined the evidence, took photographs, collected samples, and asked endless questions that I answered as best I could. They spoke in low voices among themselves, using terms like unconfirmed species and possible migration patterns. They didn't say Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but I could see it in their eyes. They were considering possibilities beyond known wildlife. More officers came the next day, setting up motion-activated cameras around my property. They offered to relocate me temporarily, but again I refused. This was my home. I wouldn't be driven from it. That night, all the cameras were destroyed. Not just damaged, but methodically taken apart, their pieces scattered across the ground. The wildlife officials looked grim when they collected the remains the following morning. "It's intelligent," one of them said quietly to his colleague. "It knew exactly what these were." The weeks stretched into months. Sightings of Nobby spread beyond my property to other parts of Cleveland County. Families in the surrounding area began to leave, some temporarily, some for good. Those who stayed formed neighborhood watches, installed powerful outdoor lights, kept dogs and guns close at hand. I stayed too, adapting to this new reality. I learned to sleep in short bursts, to distinguish between ordinary night sounds and those made by my unwelcome visitor. I reinforced doors and windows, installed my own lights, accepted the help of neighbors who came during daylight hours to assist with chores I could no longer safely do alone. The creature continued to appear regularly at the edge of my property, watching, waiting. The screams continued too, though less frequently as time passed. Sometimes weeks would go by without a sighting or sound, and just as people began to relax, to think perhaps Nobby had moved on, it would return. A dark shape in the twilight, a blood-curdling scream in the night, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. I never fired the rifle, though I kept it ready. Something told me that shooting at the creature would only escalate things, turning an uneasy coexistence into open hostility. Instead, I established boundaries, invisible lines that, if crossed, would force my hand. So far, despite the incident with the back door, Nobby had respected those boundaries, remaining at the edges, watching but not approaching. People ask me why I think it came here, why it stays. I have no answer. Perhaps it's as simple as territory. These woods, these hills have been its home longer than they've been mine. Or perhaps it's curiosity about the strange creatures who built houses and fences across its land. I don't know. I don't think any of us will ever truly know. What I do know is that Carpenter Knob changed after Nobby came. Our peaceful farming community became a place of whispers and sidelong glances, of locked doors and loaded guns. After dark, the road's empty. The windows glow with electric light meant to keep the darkness and what hides within it at bay. And me? I'm still here, still watching, still waiting. 88 years old when Nobby came. I've now seen my 90th birthday come and go. I sometimes wonder which of us will outlast the other, the old woman or the creature in the woods. Time will tell. Until then, I keep the Winchester close and my eyes on the tree line, especially as dusk falls over Carpenter Knob. Story 13. The howl of the heater was the only sound in our old Chevy Impala as we drove down Highway 10. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tight against the January chill. It was nearly midnight, and the darkness of rural Cleveland County pressed against the windows like a living thing. "Turn up the heat, Gail. I'm freezing my ass off back here," Lucy complained from the back seat. I reached for the knob, cranking it as far as it would go. "It's already maxed out. This old junker's trying its best." Wanda sat silently in the passenger seat, her face ghostly in the green glow of the dashboard lights. We were heading home after watching a movie in Shelby, taking the back way to save time. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the pitch-black night, illuminating patches of frost on the asphalt and the dense wall of pine trees lining both sides of the road. "Dad's gonna kill us for being so late," Lucy muttered, checking her watch. I shrugged. "We're adults. Well, I'm barely one, but you two definitely are." We passed a small farm, its mailbox reflecting our headlights for a brief second before disappearing into the darkness behind us. The radio played nothing but static out here, so we'd turned it off 20 minutes ago. That's when it happened. Wanda's scream shattered the quiet like a gunshot. Her body jerked violently against the seatbelt, hands pressed against the passenger window. "Stop the car! Stop the car!" she shrieked. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the cold pavement. The Impala fishtailed before coming to a stop on the shoulder. "What the hell, Wanda?" Lucy yelled from the back seat. But Wanda wasn't listening. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stared out the window into the darkness. "Wanda, what's wrong?" I grabbed her shoulder, but she flinched away from my touch, her eyes wild with terror. "I saw something," she gasped. "There was something watching us from the trees." Lucy leaned forward between the seats. "What, like a deer?" Wanda shook her head violently. "No, not a deer, not an animal. It was... Her voice broke. "It was what?" I demanded, my heart hammering against my ribs. Wanda turned to look at me, her face paper white in the dim light. "It was a monster. Under normal circumstances, I would have laughed at my 22-year-old sister using such a childish word, but the raw terror in her eyes killed any amusement before it could form." "What did it look like?" Lucy asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It was tall, really tall, standing just off the road watching us." Wanda's fingers dug into the seat cushion. "It had these eyes that caught the headlights. They glowed." I peered out into the darkness, seeing nothing but trees and shadows. "Where exactly did you see it?" "Back there," Wanda pointed behind us, "near that farm we just passed." For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the idling engine and Wanda's ragged breathing. "We should go," Lucy said finally. "Let's just go home." But something strange happened inside me then. A curiosity I couldn't explain began to override my fear. I'd lived in Cleveland County my entire life and knew these roads like the back of my hand. What could possibly be out there that I hadn't seen before? "Let's go back," I said. "What?" Lucy's voice cracked. "Are you crazy?" Wanda grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here." "Just a quick look," I insisted. 3 of us in the car, headlights on. What's the worst that could happen? Looking back now, those words haunt me. The worst was beyond anything I could have imagined. I pulled a U-turn on the empty highway, the headlights sweeping across the trees as we headed back the way we came. Wanda pressed herself against the door, as far from the window as possible. Lucy leaned forward, her breath fogging the windshield. "There," Wanda whispered, pointing toward an opening in the trees. "That's where I saw it." I slowed the car to a crawl. The headlights illuminated a dirt access road leading off the highway. Beyond it, I could make out the glint of water, a farm pond with a small dam at one end. "I don't see anything," Lucy said, squinting into the darkness. And then we all saw it. Crouched on the dam was a figure. In the first instant, my brain tried to make sense of it. A hunter, maybe, or a fisherman. But hunters don't fish at midnight in January, and this was no human shape. "Oh my God," Lucy whispered. "Oh my God." The creature was hunched over something on the dam, its back to us. Even at this distance, I could tell it was massive, far larger than any person I'd ever seen. My hands moved of their own accord, pulling the car to a stop on the shoulder. The headlights illuminated the scene like a spotlight on a stage, and the creature turned slightly, as if aware of our presence but unconcerned. "What are you doing?" Wanda hissed as I put the car in park. "I want to see what it is," I said. My voice sounded strange, detached, like it belonged to someone else. "Are you insane?" Lucy grabbed the back of my seat. "Start the car, Gail." But I was already opening my door. "Gail!" Wanda screamed, reaching for me, but I was out of the car before she could stop me. The January air hit me like a slap, the cold biting through my thin jacket. My boots crunched on the frozen gravel as I took a step forward, then another. Behind me, I heard the car doors opening, my sisters calling my name in panicked whispers, but I kept walking. I moved along the dirt access road toward the pond. Each step felt dreamlike, as if I were watching myself from above. Why was I doing this? What compelled me forward when every instinct screamed for me to run? As I approached, the creature stood. It unfolded itself to its full height, and my heart nearly stopped. It was enormous. Dale, my friend from school, stood 6'2" and was the tallest person I knew. This thing towered over what Dale's height would be. It turned to face me directly, and I froze in my tracks about 150 feet from where it stood on the dam. The creature stretched its arms outward, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to die. Its face was like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Pink flesh showed through patchy facial hair, with nostrils so wide they seemed to take up half its face. The facial hair was shorter than the coat that covered the rest of its body, almost like a man with a thin beard compared to the thick fur elsewhere. Its waist was unnaturally narrow, like something from a cartoon, but its thighs were massive, bulging with muscle that tapered to legs that were bizarrely thin below the knee. Almost as thin as a cow's, was how I described them later, though that doesn't quite capture their wrongness. The creature's coat was predominantly black with patches of brown, but what struck me most was its chest and shoulders. They were broad, impossibly broad, and covered with fur so black it seemed to absorb the headlights rather than reflect them. The fur there had a sheen to it, like oil on water. Beside the creature on the dam was something white, a large mass that I couldn't identify in the dim light. Something it had killed. The thought sent fresh terror coursing through me. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Its eyes reflected the headlights, 2 pinpricks of light in its massive face. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. And then, with a fluidity that defied its size, the creature dropped its arms and turned away. In 3 massive strides, it disappeared into the trees beyond the dam, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The spell broken, I stumbled backward, nearly falling in my haste to retreat. I ran back to the car where my sisters stood, their faces masks of horror. "Go! Go! Go!" I screamed as we piled into the Impala. Lucy was sobbing in the back seat. Wanda's hands shook so badly she couldn't buckle her seatbelt. I cranked the engine and slammed the car into drive, tires spinning on the gravel before finding purchase. We fishtailed onto the highway, the speedometer climbing past 60, 70, 80. "What was that thing?" Lucy wailed from the back seat. "What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know," I gasped, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know." "We need to tell someone," Wanda said, her voice shaking. "The police, or someone. They'll think we're crazy," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew we had to report it. Whatever we'd seen wasn't natural, it wasn't right. We drove straight to the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office in Shelby. It was past midnight by then, and only a single deputy was at the front desk, looking bored until he saw our faces. "What happened to you girls?" he asked, standing up as we burst through the door. The words tumbled out of us in a chaotic rush, each of us adding details the others missed. I expected disbelief, mockery even, but the deputy's face grew increasingly serious as we spoke. When we finished, he sighed and pulled out a report form. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "What?" The three of us spoke in unison. "We've had 6 reports in the past 2 weeks, all describing the same creature." He looked uncomfortable saying the word. "Different locations around the county, but the descriptions match." "Why haven't we heard about this?" Wanda demanded. The deputy shrugged. "Sheriff doesn't want to cause a panic. Thinks it's probably just a bear with mange or some kids playing pranks." "That was no bear," I said firmly. "And it definitely wasn't kids in a costume." He nodded slowly. "I believe you. Look, I'll take your statement, add it to the others. Maybe with enough reports, the sheriff will take this seriously." We spent the next hour giving detailed descriptions, drawing crude sketches, and pinpointing the location on a map. By the time we finished, it was nearly 2 a.m. "You girls get home safe," the deputy said as we left. "And maybe stick to the main roads for a while." We didn't sleep that night. We sat in Lucy's room until dawn, jumping at every creak and groan of our old farmhouse. Dad found us there in the morning, huddled together on Lucy's bed, still in our clothes from the night before. The story spread quickly through Cleveland County, despite the sheriff's attempts to keep it quiet. Other witnesses came forward. A trucker who'd seen it crossing Highway 74, a farmer who found strange tracks in his field, too large to belong to any known animal, a hunter who abandoned his blind after hearing something massive moving through the forest, breaking trees as it went. For weeks, I couldn't drive after dark. Every shadow in the woods became that creature in my mind. I had nightmares where I was back on that dirt road walking toward the dam, but in the dreams, I couldn't stop walking, even as the creature approached me. Reporters came from Charlotte, then from Atlanta and New York. They called it the Cleveland County Monster in their articles. Cryptozoologists arrived with their equipment and theories. Some said it was a Bigfoot. Others claimed it was an escaped government experiment or an alien. We told our story again and again until the words lost all meaning. The more I repeated it, the less real it felt, as if I were describing a movie I'd seen rather than something that happened to me. But when I'm alone at night, when the wind blows through the pines outside my window, I know it was real. Sometimes I drive past that pond in the daylight. It looks so ordinary, so mundane, just a small farm pond with a dam at one end surrounded by trees. No one would ever guess what stood there that January night. The sheriff's office eventually closed the investigation. No conclusive evidence was ever found. No bodies, no clear tracks, no irrefutable proof, just the testimonies of terrified witnesses and a handful of blurry photographs that could have been anything. But we know what we saw. Wanda, Lucy and I, we know. Sometimes when we're together and no one else is around, we talk about it. We compare details, making sure our memories haven't changed over time. The pink face with the wide nostrils, the shiny black fur on its chest, the impossibly thin waist and spindly lower legs, the white mass beside it on the dam. What was it doing there? Where did it come from? Where did it go? These questions haunt me, but I've stopped looking for answers. Some things are better left unknown. I still live in Cleveland County. I couldn't leave if I wanted to. Something about that night ties me to this place, as if by witnessing the creature, I became part of its territory. Sometimes, on cold January nights when the moon is hidden and the darkness is complete, I roll down my car window while driving along Highway 10. I listen to the sounds of the forest, straining to hear something that doesn't belong. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear it. Story 14. I checked my watch, 4:17 a.m. Perfect timing, the best trout bite just before dawn, when the water's still and cool. March 15th, 1991. I'll never forget that date. You set up over there, Marcus. I'll take the bend, Darrell said, pointing downstream. My brother-in-law knew these waters better than anyone in Rutherford County. We'd been fishing the Broad River together since he married my sister 8 years ago. Darrell Patterson was a factory worker with calloused hands and the patience of a statue when it came to fishing. Me, I worked construction, and fishing was my escape from the noise. I nodded and made my way toward a large, flat rock situated about 15 feet from the shoreline. The rock gave me a perfect vantage point, allowing me to cast into a deeper pool where trout like to hold during early spring mornings. The night was darker than usual, no moon at all. Our flashlights cut yellow paths through the darkness as we separated. Once I reached my rock, I switched mine off to let my eyes adjust. The darkness pressed in close, broken only by a sprinkling of stars reflecting off the water's surface. The Broad River whispered around my rock, its cold currents slipping past with quiet urgency. I assembled my rod, tied on a small spinnerbait, and began casting into the darkness. The familiar rhythm calmed me. Cast, retrieve, cast, retrieve. The only sounds were water sliding over stones and the occasional splash of my lure hitting the surface. Nothing biting yet, but that was fine. The peace was worth the trip alone. For half an hour, I fished in contented silence. The temperature hovered around 40 degrees, and my breath formed small clouds that disappeared instantly. The first hint of dawn hadn't even touched the sky yet. Then something changed. I can't explain exactly what I felt first. A pressure in the air, maybe. A stillness that seemed wrong. The hair on my arm stood up despite my flannel shirt and jacket. I stopped mid-cast, my body suddenly tense. Something was watching me. I turned toward the shoreline, my eyes straining in the darkness. At first I saw nothing unusual, just the familiar outline of trees against the slightly lighter sky. Then I spotted it, standing perfectly still, about 35 feet away on the bank, was a figure, not a human figure, something else. My first coherent thought was bear, but I dismissed it immediately. This thing stood upright, completely vertical, and much too tall. Even in the darkness, I could make out its massive silhouette, at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8, with broad shoulders and a slightly hunched posture. I froze, my fishing rod forgotten in my hands. The creature didn't move. We just looked at each other across that short expanse of river. I could feel its eyes on me, actually feel them, though I couldn't see them clearly in the darkness. Time stretched. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. I couldn't breathe, couldn't call out, couldn't move. Fear had turned my muscles to concrete. Then it moved. Not toward me, thank God. With deliberate, fluid motions that no bear could ever manage, it turned to its right and began walking up the steep mountainside. It moved at about a 45-degree angle, taking long, measured strides. I counted each step without realizing I was doing it. 17, 18, 19, 20. Then it disappeared into a dense thicket of mountain laurel and rhododendron. I remained frozen on my rock, my fishing rod clutched in white-knuckled hands. The river continued to flow around me, oblivious to what had just happened. Minutes passed. My breath came in short, painful gasps. "Marcus!" Darrell's voice startled me so badly I nearly fell into the water. "Marcus, did you see that thing?" He was splashing through the shallows toward me, his own rod abandoned somewhere behind him. Even in the darkness, I could see the wild look on his face. "Yeah," I managed to croak. "I saw it." "Jesus Christ," he said, reaching my rock. "Jesus Christ, Marcus. We need to go. I said, already breaking down my rod with trembling hands. Right now. We didn't speak again until we reached Darrell's truck, parked on a dirt pull-off about a quarter-mile from where we'd been fishing. The first hint of dawn was lightening the eastern sky, but the shadows under the trees were still impenetrable. Darrell fumbled with his keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the doors. We threw our gear in the back and climbed in. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness. Neither of us spoke as he reversed, turned around and headed back toward the main road, gravel crunching under the tires. 5 minutes passed before either of us found our voices. "What did you see?" I finally asked, needing to confirm we'd witnessed the same thing. Darrell's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "It was watching me from behind some trees about 50 feet away. I thought it was a hunter at first, but it was too big. Then it moved, and I knew." "Knew what?" "That it wasn't human. And it wasn't any goddamn bear either." I nodded. It was covered in hair, dark brown, maybe grayish. Hard to tell in the dark. "Yeah," Darrell agreed. "And the way it walked, that was no animal I've ever seen. It was upright the whole time, like a man, but not a man." "It stood still for so long, just staring at me," I said, the memory sending fresh chills down my spine. "Then it just walked away up that hillside. Didn't run, didn't charge, just walked away." Darrell glanced at me. "What do you think it was?" I shook my head. "I don't know." But I did know, or thought I did. We both did. We just couldn't bring ourselves to say it out loud. We stopped at the Waffle House just outside of town. The fluorescent lights and smell of coffee and bacon grounded us back in reality. We sat in a booth far from the other customers, ordered coffee, and tried to process what we'd seen. "We need to report it," Darrell said after a while. I looked at him like he was crazy. "Report what? That we saw Bigfoot. They'll laugh us out of the county." "Maybe not," he replied. "Rutherford's a small place. If something's out there, people should know." I sipped my coffee, considering. "Let's go to Sheriff Thomas. He's known us since we were kids. At least he won't think we're drunk or on drugs." After breakfast, we drove to the sheriff's office. The dispatcher, Betty Larkins, raised her eyebrows when we asked to speak to Sheriff Thomas about something we saw in the woods, but she buzzed us through. Sheriff Robert Thomas was a big man in his 50s, with a salt and pepper mustache and eyes that didn't miss much. He listened without interruption as we described what we'd seen, taking occasional notes on a yellow legal pad. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You boys aren't the first to come in this month with a story like this." That caught me off guard. "What?" He nodded. "Had 3 reports in the past 2 weeks. Hikers up near Bat Cave, a Forest Service worker checking trails, an old man Simmons who lives out on that isolated property by Chimney Rock. All describe something similar to what you're telling me." Darrell and I exchanged glances. I felt a strange mixture of relief and heightened fear. "What are you doing about it?" Darrell asked. Sheriff Thomas sighed. "What can I do? I've increased patrols in the area. Got the Forest Service to post some warning signs about unusual wildlife activity. Can't exactly put out an APB on Bigfoot, can I?" "So you think that's what it is?" I asked. "I think something's out there that doesn't fit our normal understanding of Rutherford County wildlife," he replied carefully. "And until I know more, I'm treating these sightings seriously." He took our contact information and asked us to call if we remembered any additional details. As we were leaving, he stopped us. "One more thing. Where exactly were you fishing?" I described the location as precisely as I could. "That's less than a mile from where Simmons saw his," the sheriff noted. "Seems to be sticking to that general area." Outside, Darrell and I sat in his truck for a long time without starting the engine. "Told you we weren't crazy," he finally said. "No," I agreed. "Just unlucky." The following week was difficult. I couldn't sleep more than a couple hours at a stretch. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing on the riverbank, watching me. I'd jerk awake, heart racing, convinced something was outside my window. My wife, Linda, was worried sick about me, but didn't know what to say when I told her what had happened. She believed I'd seen something, but preferred to think it was a bear or some other explainable animal. Darryl wasn't faring any better. My sister called to tell me he'd been sleeping on the couch with a shotgun nearby. He'd installed motion sensor lights all around their property and jumped at every sound. By Friday, I needed answers. I went to the county library and asked the librarian, Miss Franks, for anything they had on Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings in western North Carolina. She gave me a strange look, but directed me to a small collection of books and local history compilations. What I found surprised me. The Appalachian Mountains, particularly around our region, had a long history of such sightings. The Cherokee had stories of a creature they called Sulkalu, or slant-eyed giant. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers occasionally reported strange encounters in the mountains. In the 1970s, there had been a flurry of sightings, including several in Rutherford County. I photocopied several pages and took them to Darryl's house that evening. We spread them across his kitchen table while my sister made coffee and tried not to look too concerned. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a report from 1976. 3 hunters near Brown Mountain encountered a 7-foot creature covered in dark hair. It watched them for several minutes before walking away. Sound familiar? Darryl nodded grimly. And here's one from 1982, just outside Asheville. A family camping reported something peeking into their tent at night, then finding huge human-like footprints the next morning. So whatever we saw, it's been around a long time, I said. That doesn't make me feel better, Marcus. My sister Janet finally spoke up. Will you two please stop this? You saw a bear, or maybe a really tall hiker, but this is just feeding each other's fears. Janet, you weren't there, Darryl said quietly. This wasn't a bear. Then what was it? She demanded. Neither of us had an answer. 2 days later, Sheriff Thomas called me. There had been another sighting, this time by a family picnicking near where we'd been fishing. They'd seen a large, hair-covered figure watching them from the trees. When they shouted, it had disappeared into the forest. I'm holding a public meeting at the town hall tomorrow night, the sheriff said. I'd appreciate if you and Darryl would come, maybe share your experience. People are getting nervous. The meeting was packed. It seemed like half of Rutherford County had shown up, from curious teenagers to concerned parents to old-timers who'd lived in the mountains all their lives. Sheriff Thomas stood at a podium at the front of the room, trying to maintain order as questions flew from every direction. Is it dangerous? Should we keep our kids indoors? Is the state wildlife agency doing anything? Has anyone tried to capture it? The sheriff raised his hands for quiet. Listen, folks, we don't have all the answers yet. What we do know is that several credible witnesses have reported seeing something unusual in the Batcave area. No one has been attacked or threatened. It seems to be observing rather than engaging. He then asked if any witnesses in the room would share their experiences. An uncomfortable silence fell until Darryl stood up. My brother-in-law, Marcus, and I saw it on March 15th, while fishing the Broad River, he said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. It was before dawn, no moon. The thing was standing on the shoreline, watching us, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair. It wasn't a bear. It walked upright, like a man, but bigger, up a steep hillside and disappeared into the brush. After Darryl sat down, others began to share. Old Man Simmons described how the creature had stood at the edge of his property for 10 minutes, just watching his house. A Forest Service worker told how she'd found strange footprints and broken branches along a remote trail. A family described their picnic being observed by something hiding in the trees. The pattern was consistent. The creature watched but didn't approach, remained in the same general area, and appeared most often at dawn or dusk. After the meeting, a small group of us gathered outside. Besides me and Darrell, there was Simmons, the Forest Service worker, whose name was Rachel, and a couple who'd seen the creature while hiking. "I've worked these forests for 12 years, Rachel said quietly. "There's always been stories, but I never believed them until I saw those tracks. Whatever it is, it's real." "My grandpa used to tell stories about the mountain man," Simmons added. "Said it was best to leave offerings of food at the edge of your property to keep it friendly. I thought they were just old tales until last week." "What do we do now?" the hiker's wife asked. None of us had an answer. The county put up warning signs at all trailheads in the area, advising hikers and campers to be alert and travel in groups. The local paper ran a front-page story about the sightings, which unfortunately attracted thrill-seekers and self-proclaimed Bigfoot hunters from surrounding states. For weeks, the woods around Batcave were crawling with people carrying cameras and recording equipment. Predictably, the creature wasn't seen during this time. By May, the excitement had died down, the outsiders had left, and life in Rutherford County mostly returned to normal. But not for me and Darrell. We never went back to our fishing spot on the Broad River. We found new places to fish, always in open areas with good visibility, and never before full daylight. I installed better locks on my doors and windows and bought a more powerful flashlight that I kept by my bed. The nightmares eventually became less frequent, but never fully disappeared. Sometimes years later, I'd still wake up feeling watched. The image of that silent figure standing on the riverbank burned into my memory. I don't know what we saw that moonless March night in 1991. I only know what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man, and it wasn't something I could simply forget. Sometimes on quiet evenings when the wind blows down from the mountains, I find myself staring toward the dark line of trees at the edge of town, and I wonder if somewhere in those ancient forests something is staring back. Story 15. I still hear those sounds in my dreams, the snap of branches, the rustling leaves, the way it moved through pitch-black woods like it could see in the dark. It's been over 50 years since that night outside Folkestone, but some memories don't fade. They just wait for you to close your eyes. My name's Mike Lawson. I served 3 tours in Vietnam before coming home to North Carolina in '69. The military taught me to sleep with one eye open, a habit that probably saved my life that night in Georgia. It was June 1971. I was driving my family, my wife Sarah and our 2 kids, Jimmy and Lizzie, down to visit Sarah's folks in Jacksonville, Florida. We'd packed our old Ford pickup with everything we'd need for a 2-week stay. The kids were excited about seeing the ocean. Sarah was looking forward to home cooking. Me, I was just happy to be on the road, away from the factory job I'd taken after discharge. We'd made decent time through most of North Carolina, but once we hit South Carolina, the truck started making noises. Nothing serious at first, just a rattle here, a ping there. I kept an eye on the temperature gauge, made sure we weren't overheating. By the time we crossed into Georgia, though, the rattles had turned to clanks, and I knew we were in trouble. Around 9 p.m., just outside Folkestone in Charlton County, the engine gave a final wheeze and died. We coasted to the side of the road, about a quarter-mile from the nearest house, a small farmhouse set back from the road. This was long before cell phones. Hell, we didn't even have a CB radio. "Stay put," I told Sarah and the kids. "I'll walk down to that house and see if I can use their phone." "Be careful," Sarah said. She always worried. Maybe because she'd spent 3 years wondering if I'd come home from Southeast Asia in a box. The night was hot and thick with humidity. June in Georgia feels like walking through soup. Crickets and frogs made a racket from the ditches as I walked. The stars were bright overhead, no moon yet, just the kind of night that makes you feel small. I knocked on the door of the farmhouse, and after a minute a man answered. Tall fellow, maybe 60, with weathered skin and suspicious eyes. Called himself Earl Tanner. Truck broke down, I explained. Got my family with me. Need to use your phone to call a tow. Earl shook his head. Phone's out since yesterday's storm. Nearest service station's in town, and Clyde closes up at 6. My heart sank. We're stuck till morning then. Earl studied me for a moment. I must have passed whatever test he was giving, because he nodded toward a field beside his property. Y'all can camp there tonight if you want. Got a spot near the creek that's flat. Be better than sleeping in your truck on the roadside. I thanked him and went back to tell Sarah. We had a tent in the truck bed. We'd planned to camp a few nights on our way down to save money. Sarah wasn't thrilled about camping here, but she saw the sense in it. We drove the truck down a dirt track Earl pointed out, parking near a small creek. The kids were tired and cranky. Sarah set up the tent while I unloaded what we'd need for the night. I'm worried about leaving everything in the truck, Sarah said as we finished setting up. We've got all our clothes, the new camera. She was right. We'd packed everything we owned of value. The truck was open in the back, only a tarp covering our belongings. I'll sleep in the cab, I decided. You take the kids in the tent. Sarah didn't like this plan. Mike, I don't want to sleep separate. It's just one night, I assured her. I'm a light sleeper anyway. I'll be fine. The truth was, I still had nights where I woke up swinging, the jungle still alive in my head. Better for me to be alone if that happened. Sarah reluctantly agreed, and after we got the kids settled, she joined them in the tent. I reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, which wasn't much. The vinyl seat was sticky against my neck. I kept the windows cracked for air. The night sounds surrounded me, cicadas, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. Familiar sounds, safe sounds. I don't know exactly when I fell asleep. The next thing I knew, something had changed. The cicadas had gone quiet. The frogs, too. That silence, that's what woke me. Every soldier knows that sudden silence means danger. I kept my eyes closed, listening. There was something moving outside the truck, not an animal. The footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy. They circled the vehicle slowly, pausing at each corner. My hand slid to my belt, where I kept my folding knife. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. The footsteps stopped at the driver's door. I felt it before I saw it, that sense of being watched. The hairs on my arms stood up. I opened my eyes. There was a face pressed against the window, just inches from mine. My first thought was that Earl had come to check on us. But this wasn't Earl. This wasn't anyone I'd ever seen before. It looked almost human. Almost. The face was broad, with a wide nose and large eyes that caught what little starlight filtered through the trees. But what struck me most was the hair. A massive, matted tangle that extended outward from the head in all directions, like some enormous afro. But this wasn't a styled hairdo. This was wild, untamed, stretching a good foot from the scalp in a perfect circle around the head. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. I wasn't immediately afraid. Surprised, yes. Confused, definitely, but not afraid. I'd seen enough in Nam to know that fear is a luxury you can't always afford. I reached for the door handle. The metallic click of the latch was loud in the silence. The moment the latch engaged, the face disappeared, not just moved back, vanished, like someone had pulled it away at impossible speed. I shoved the door open and jumped out, scanning the area around the truck. A flash of movement caught my eye, a dark figure darting toward the back of the pickup. I followed, rounding the tailgate just in time to see it sprint down the embankment toward the creek. It ran on 2 legs. That's important to understand. This wasn't an animal on all fours. This was bipedal, moving with a strange loping gait that ate up ground faster than any human runner I'd ever seen. And it was heading straight into the woods. Pitch-black woods with no trail, no moonlight to guide it. I stopped at the edge of the embankment. The woods beyond the creek were a solid wall of darkness. No one could navigate that at a run. It was suicide. Branches would take out your eyes, roots would trip you, trunks would stop you cold. But the crashing continued, loud snaps of breaking branches, the violent rustle of disturbed undergrowth. The sounds didn't slow or stop. They continued at the same frantic pace, deeper and deeper into the forest, until they faded with distance. I stood there, knife in hand, listening as the normal night sounds gradually returned. Crickets first, then frogs, the world resetting itself. My heart pounded against my ribs, sweat coated my skin despite the night breeze. I've been in firefights where I felt calmer. I checked the tent. Sarah and the kids were still asleep, undisturbed. The truck looked untouched. Nothing missing, nothing damaged. Just that face at the window and those impossible sounds in the woods. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat in the driver's seat, knife open on my lap, watching the tree line until dawn broke over the fields. The rising sun painted the landscape in shades of orange and gold, beautiful, normal, as if nothing strange had happened at all. When Sarah woke, I didn't tell her what I'd seen. What would I say? That some wild-haired person, or something that looked like a person, had been watching me sleep. That it had run through impossible terrain at impossible speeds. She'd think I'd had another episode, one of my jungle dreams, as she called them. After breakfast, while Sarah packed up the tent, I walked down to the creek and crossed it. The morning dew soaked my jeans as I pushed into the tree line, searching for, I don't know what. Evidence, I guess. Proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The woods were dense with underbrush, exactly as I'd thought the night before. No one could run through this, especially not in pitch darkness, yet something had. I found broken branches high up on the trunks, 7 or 8 feet off the ground, too high for deer. Some of the breaks were fresh, the wood still oozing sap. I followed the trail of disturbance about 50 yards in, then lost it where the woods thickened further. No footprints that I could find. The ground was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves. But something had come through here, and recently. "Mike!" Sarah's voice called from the campsite. "Earl's here with his tractor." I gave the woods one last look, then headed back. Earl had brought his old farmall to tow us into town. He looked at my muddy boots and wet pant legs. "Find something interesting in there?" he asked, nodding toward the woods. "Just looking around," I said. Earl's eyes narrowed slightly. "Dangerous place, those woods. Easy to get turned around, especially for folks not from here." There was something in his tone, a warning maybe, or knowledge he wasn't sharing. I wanted to ask him about it, about what might live in those woods, but Sarah was there with the kids, and the moment passed. We loaded up, and Earl towed us into Folkestone. Clyde at the service station diagnosed a blown head gasket. 3 days to fix, he said. We got a room at the Pinewood Motel on the edge of town, a small, clean place run by a widow named Mrs. Haverty. That evening, while Sarah was giving the kids their baths, I walked down to the motel office. Mrs. Haverty was watching her small black-and-white TV, some game show with flashing lights. "Excuse me, Mum," I said. "I was wondering if you knew of any unusual stories about the woods out near Earl Tanner's place." She muted the TV. "Unusual how, Mr. Lawson?" I hesitated. "Stories about people, or things, living out there. Things that might not be the normal." Mrs. Haverty's face changed. The polite smile disappeared, replaced by a guarded look. "Those are just old stories," she said. "Nothing for tourists to worry about." "I'd still like to hear them." She sighed. "Some folks around here talk about the hare people. Been stories about them since before my time. Supposed to be wild folk living deep in the Okefenokee. Some say they're just hermits gone feral. Others say they're something else altogether." "Hare people?" "On account of their hair, supposed to be like a lion's mane all around their heads. Old-timers say they can run faster than deer, see in the dark like cats, steal chickens, sometimes children if you believe the really old tales." She waved a dismissive hand. Just stories to keep kids from wandering off into the swamp. But her eyes told a different story. There was belief there, or at least the shadow of it. Has anyone ever seen one? Recently, I mean. Mrs. Haverty studied me. You saw something out there, didn't you? By Earl's place. I nodded slowly. Earl knows better than to let strangers camp there, she said, almost to herself. That creek marks a boundary of sorts. Local folks know to stay on the north side after dark. What exactly are they? I pressed. I don't know that anyone knows for sure, Mr. Lawson. Some say they're a lost tribe, cut off from civilization. Some say they're something older, been here since before people came. She switched the TV sound back on, signaling the end of our conversation. Either way, you're lucky. They usually don't just watch. I walked back to our room, my mind racing. Sarah was reading to the kids when I returned. Normal. Safe. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to reconcile what I'd seen with what Mrs. Haverty had told me. We spent 3 days in Folkestone while Clyde fixed our truck. I didn't see anything strange again. We continued on to Florida, had our visit with Sarah's family, and drove home to North Carolina without incident. Life went back to normal. Work at the factory, little league games, Sunday dinners. But sometimes when I'm alone, I think about that face at the window. Those eyes watching me in the darkness, the impossible speed through impenetrable woods, the warnings that came too late. I've never told anyone else about what I saw that night. Who would believe me? A man who still jumps at backfiring cars, who sometimes wakes up fighting invisible enemies, who would take my word about some wild-haired creature in the Georgia woods. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the house is still, I imagine it's still out there, running through darkness that would blind any man, watching from the edges of civilized places, waiting. And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't woken up?